Good morning. We'll start our second panel this morning. This panel is going to be on environmental impacts of electric vehicle charging stations. We have today Joseph Haslow. Oh, sorry, Household. I did say his name wrong before. We also have Noah Garcia. Joseph is an attorney with the Sierra Club, and Noah Garcia is a Snyder Fellow with Natural Resources Defense Council. And we also have Dan Bowermaster, who is with EWRI. He is a program director, program manager. So what we'll do is we'll start off with their presentations, and Joseph has volunteered to go first, so we'll start off with you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here. You might be wondering, who is this 15-year-old boy up here talking to you? I've been the primary attorney for Sierra Club, engaged on issues of the nexus of utility regulation and investment in electric vehicles and electric vehicles themselves. And that work has taken me across the country, from California to Northeast, Michigan, and Missouri. And also all stages of programs working on threshold issues here in Missouri and Michigan, through working with stakeholders like ChargePoint to get programs approved in California. So that's why, in spite of my boyish face, my hair is still on. First, I want to talk about the environmental footprint of conventional internal combustion engine vehicles as compared to battery electric vehicles in Missouri under current grid conditions, without touching the question of grid integration. And then second, I'll layer on the environmental implications from load management of EV demand. And as Mr. Ellis pointed out, this workshop is headlined about electric vehicle charging stations, but it's really about the cars in the end. And so that is where I'll start. I have stolen this quote from Missouri's Comprehensive Energy Plan, and it tells us that Missouri not only doesn't make very much oil or refine it, but in fact spends about $15 billion a year on fuel costs, most of which is going out of state into somebody else's pocket. Now, I'm cheating a little bit, right? In 2012, oil was at $100 a barrel. This morning I looked, it's about half that, $50 a barrel. So even so, spending $7.5 billion a year on gas, most of which are going somewhere else. Now, utility companies, this may be the first time you hear this from a Sierra Club attorney, but a lot of that money could be yours, and I'm rooting for you. Now, just as transportation plays an outsized economic role, it plays an outsized role in creating air pollution in the state as well. So internal combustion engine cars emit a whole host of particulate matter and toxic compounds that have respiratory, cardiovascular, developmental, reproductive harms, not to mention increasingly understood to cause premature death. Now, to take one fluke example, because we're on the verge of ozone season, Missouri is violating 2008 ozone standards, and St. Louis in particular has struggled to meet them. Now, 50% of ozone precursors come from transportation sources. That is a huge number. And recent modeling suggests that on average, over 10 parts per billion are attributable to on-road emissions. What does that really mean? So in Missouri, this means that we're looking at over 1,000 premature deaths occur each year, particulate matter and ozone emissions from autos alone. In St. Louis, to get even more personal, it would be over 200 premature deaths a year. In Kansas City, around the same number. So this begs the question, given a generation profile that's heavy on coal in this state, it's important to understand the benefits of EV use in Missouri. Oh, I'm sorry. I also want to talk about greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation, and this is across the country, but I was looking at figures this morning, it's largely applicable in Missouri. Greenhouse gas emissions are about 26% from transportation. And of that, about 60% is light-duty vehicles. So turning now to what operation of electric vehicle looks like in this state. So we know that air quality and GHG benefits vary with generation source. And there have been questions raised, and rightly so, at this commission about what the environmental benefits are of EVs. Now, Unit of Concerned Scientists has done a rigorous analysis on this, analyzing electric vehicles from cradle to grave, considering the manufacturing costs, the production costs for fuel as compared to internal combustion engine vehicles and fuel production costs for them. The mile per gallon equivalency of an EV in Missouri versus the greenhouse gas emissions is 35 miles per gallon. That's not half bad. The average internal combustion engine vehicle sold today is about 24 miles per gallon. And on-road vehicles average about 21 miles per gallon. EPA tells me that a Nissan Leaf in Jefferson City emits CO2 emissions of 260 grams per mile. What does that mean? Well, the national average is a bit better. Generation across the country is averaged out at lower emissions than coal in the state, about 170 grams per mile. The total CO2 emissions rate for the average gasoline car across the country is 440 grams per mile. So we're doing pretty well with EVs as far as greenhouse gas emissions go. As far as air quality impacts, Dan might talk a little bit about EPRI's scope analysis, which is actually done with NRDC about what air quality impacts might be from high levels of EV penetration across the country. We can look at that on a localized impact. In Missouri, there are measurable benefits of air quality when it comes to transition to electric vehicles. And in fact, those will be even more improved as we have cleaner and cleaner sources of electricity. Now, aside from a cleaner future grid, which my colleague Noah will talk a little bit about, how can we maximize environmental benefits of electric vehicles in Missouri today? Well, environmental impacts from charging and benefits are actually closely tied to vehicle grid integration and load management. Mr. Ellis also noted in his earlier presentation that EV load is like no other load ever. I couldn't agree more. My colleague at NRDC, his organization has put it that there's no other load of comparable magnitude that's flexible enough to be pushed to hours of the day when the system is underutilized or when there's overgeneration of renewable resources. Now, to the extent possible, I'm going to try and touch on load management from the perspective of environmental benefits, so as not to steal thunder from vehicle to grid later. So here you can see results from an EV project study showing EV loads on the grid with and without time of use rates. And the results are striking. Looking here at the top, in San Diego, where we do have time of use rates, we have load coming on almost uniformly at midnight on the weekday and on the weekend. By comparison, in contrast, in Nashville, without time of use rates, we have load coming on as people are coming home from work. You can see the load start to spike, start to ramp up at about 4 o'clock and spiking up between 6 and 8, which coincides with summer peak loads. So how does this translate into environmental benefits? And how do we teach people and teach their cars to charge in this manner? Well, first, getting the cars to do it involves price signals, it involves education, it also involves siting chargers in locations that offer the best opportunity for utilization. The car is a strange creature. It sits still for most of the day. So if we put charging stations in those places where cars are most often seated, okay, we have better control over the time when we're coming online with the grid. I'm sure we'll talk more about that later. But in terms of translating to environmental benefits, I want to use this slide for illustration purposes. This is idealized for the Sierra Club. This is a resource use plotted against the demand curve over time of day. First, I'll draw your attention to the top of the graph, where we have our peaker plants fast ramping combustion turbines. These are inefficient sources and they're costly, so I bring them on last. But they're also the most polluting. So if we fail to manage EV load, we don't discourage it when people from plugging in when they get home from work, because we're only using electricity costs, flat volumetric rates. We implicate dirtier resources. Not to mention risk distribution system impacts, which were alluded to by Mr. Hedges when it comes to midnight ranking. Now I'll draw your attention to the bottom part of the graph, showing the time when we showing renewables, which are increasingly the least costly resource on the grid, also the cleanest. And so just so we can control EVs to avoid peaks, we can control them to pair with renewable power. The last panel we talked a little bit about this. There's a couple different methods that are possible to achieve at scale now. One is sort of a reverse demand response, where we're purposefully pushing charging profiles so as to absorb excess sunlight in the middle of the day. We might do that using a time varying rate, or we might do that by varying our actual draw and charging load. The other way is that we can try to accomplish load following, and you see here, we have a renewables forecast. We have what the unscheduled EV charging load might look like, and then we have, if we incentivize charging at the right times, or force it to be at the right times, we can better follow optimized load, avoiding peak, and also absorbing more of that renewable power. And I know my time is out, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Dan Bowermaster from EPRI for the Electric Power Research Institute. Thank you very much for having us here. If you haven't heard of EPRI, we're a nonprofit. We exist for the public good, so as I explained to my family around the Thanksgiving table. Yes, we get about 2/3 of our, or maybe 3/4 of our funding from utilities, and that's the remainder comes from the government. But since we're a nonprofit, our funders may or may not like our results. So we're here for the public. We don't do any lobbying. A bunch of data ahead. However, our data does get used both on the technical side as well as on the policy side. So glad to be here today. We'll talk briefly about just kind of the market. James and others touched on this already, so I'll just kind of highlight some things that hasn't been brought up yet. This is kind of foundational. And then I'll talk about the grid. And then, despite the fact that we have this panel later, we keep talking about the managed charging too, so that'll be fun. So, headlines. We get upbeat about headlines. So just so everyone knows, U.S. sales were flat 2014, 2015. However, global sales increased dramatically. And again, all this stuff is all about scale. However, if you look at the kind of the quarter on quarter, 2015 right there, where the end of the red arrow is, versus 2016, there's already a huge jump comparing 2016 to 2015. So I don't get too bad out of shape about the monthly headlines. Quarterly is a little bit better than monthly, but it's all about the trends. I think one of the main reasons is that there's increasing customer choice, which we'll talk about in a second. Pulled this last night from our registration data. It's we have about 2,600 electric vehicles in the state of Missouri, and as we saw earlier, there's one of the state 7 that are in Kansas City. So it's the Leaf, the Volt, the Ford Energy Twin, the Tesla, and the Prius, the Toyota Prius. So more cars are coming. And yes, 6 or 7 of the top 10 vehicles in the U.S. every year are either trucks, SUVs, or crossovers. So it's not just about the little city cars. As my boss likes to say, the world doesn't need another plug-in electric city car. So there's good news. Chrysler's coming out with a plug-in minivan later this year. Mitsubishi's finally coming out with their, releasing their crossover, plug-in crossover this year. It's already sold 100,000 around the world. So you're starting to see more and more vehicles come on filling these gaps that customers want. Now, I don't have inside knowledge of Ford, but Ford has formally announced they're going to have a hybrid truck and SUV by the end of the decade. So whether or not there's a plug on that, they haven't officially confirmed. I'll let each of you place your own bets. So now I want to talk a bit about the grid. And this gives you a kind of a 10-year snapshot of 2003 to 2013, and you can see those funny numbers at the top, 15, 70, and 50. And what that does, went from top to bottom. The first line, you can see the decrease in And carbon dioxide was in here, that's a 15% decrease. Then the green line in the middle, that's sulfur dioxide, is really bad for you. It's a 70% decrease, and then nitrous oxides of nitrogen, 50% decrease at the same time. So the point is, the grid, this is the U.S. grid, is clean and getting cleaner. Now the obvious question is, well, what about me? What about my area? So here, this eye chart, you can have these slides, basically shows how everyone's grid, if you divide it into these, we'll run with 15 different areas, everyone's grid is either slightly getting better or getting a lot better. You see at the bottom, the Pacific and that's California, like increased a little bit, drought, so less hydro. And then if you look at the 20, I'm trying to remember my dates here, but the down in Southern California, it's close to a big nuclear plant, so this number probably actually goes up a little bit too for California. So most of these slides come from a report we did together with the National Resources Defense Council. We did it first in 2007, then we just refreshed it in September of last year. It looked at a full, what happens if you electrify everything, and it looked at, the intent here is to save you guys the joy of reading 3 volumes and multiple hundreds of pages of reports and kind of summarize the high-level conclusion. So the report looked at electrifying the full transportation portfolio based on two scenarios, like a business as usual and then call it increased renewables or greener. But this was just based off, the increased renewables was just based off of kind of policy stuff that's already in place. So you would think it's not that aggressive. And then it looks at 2 kind of pollutants. It looks at greenhouse gases, which warms the planet, and it looks at air quality, which hurts all of our health. So this chart looks at the greenhouse gases, and people always ask about battery manufacturing and the emissions from it. But there's a tiny little line right here. It's gray. It's on top of this dark green. So I don't think anybody playing on this can see it, because I certainly can. The idea. So first of all, getting battery manufacturing is extremely hard. There's a joke in the industry that people who talk don't know, and people who know don't talk. So the scientists did the best they could to come up with that. That's what we can call this an industry best estimate right now of battery manufacturing. So I guess it's important to walk out of here and just know that the emissions for increased battery manufacturing are relatively small relative to everything else. So what about ozone? So this is also a Thanksgiving table question. So what about ozone? You always hear about, there's a hole in the ozone layer. Don't we want more ozone? Well, there's ozone way up in the sky that has a hole in it. That's like the umbrella. That's good. We want ozone up there. But the ozone that we're all talking about is ground level ozone. That's also very vital to health. And you can see basically the darker the green or more the blue, the more there's a reduction in ground level ozone. So the idea is if you look out to 2030 on ozone, that transportation electrification is also beneficial to good health. What about those headlines? There are quite often articles in the newspaper online saying like, well, electric car is actually more polluting than, if you include the grid emissions, than you pick your favorite SUV or pickup truck. And here's why. So these are a bunch of studies, and as well as grid reality on here, and it just looks at carbon emissions. So and you can see the scale on the y-axis. It goes from 0 to 700, and these dots right here, that's actual. What these studies that have, you can see there's between a 2 to 3x difference in what actual has been and what some of these studies have created. This isn't bad science. It's hard to model the grid, and it's hard to get current information. So if you ever get the question of like, oh, well, actually my Hummer is cleaner to drive than your polluting electric vehicle, here's often the reason why behind some of those articles. So that's all for now. Happy to answer questions later. Thank you.
All right, I know it's almost lunch, but please hang with me. Can everyone hear me in the back? Great.
see it up there?
No. I have it on a flash drive if.
Yes.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah, it's that one.
Okay.
Great. Hi everyone, my name is Noah Garcia from the Natural Resources Defense Council. I'd just like to thank the commission and staff for giving me the opportunity to speak about the environmental benefits of EV charging today. And with that, I'll start with a slide that everyone's probably already pretty familiar with, but here's Missouri's generation mix over the last 10 years or so. It's pretty unsurprising, but coal is by far and away the dominant resource here, followed by some contributions from nuclear, wind, natural gas. And with generation results like this, there may be some skepticism as to how clean EVs actually are compared to conventional vehicles. And I'm here to sort of push back on that. So I know this is a busy slide, but stick with me. So on the top left, we have DOE's vehicle emissions calculator, which essentially takes a state's given generation mix and estimates, under given assumptions, the annual emissions per vehicle under different EV types compared to a gasoline-powered vehicle. And as you can see here, although Missouri's generation mix is, a little bit dirtier than the U.S. on average, which is posted below here, overall, electric vehicles still come out cleaner than gasoline vehicles in the state. For example, looking at BEVs, which are all electric vehicles, they still emit about 27% less CO2 than their gasoline counterparts in the state. And you can go online and play with this calculator yourself too, it's pretty cool. Also looking next at criteria pollutants, there's also a pretty interesting story to tell here. So on the left, we have Missouri's power sector criteria pollutant emissions for SO2 and NOx that Dan sort of went over briefly. And as you can tell over time since 2005, these emissions have come down significantly, and that's largely thanks to emissions reductions from CARE and CASPER, most likely. And these sort of emissions reductions have huge public health gains. For example, when approximately 50,000 people per year are dying from traffic pollution emissions alone, there definitely is room to improve. And that's something that Joe has already touched upon. All right, so looking long term, the gentleman in the green shirt over there actually stole some of my talking points. But these EVs do get cleaner over time. For example, just looking at the short term, KCP&L just signed some great new long-term wind contracts, and that's slowly bringing us towards decarbonizing Missouri's grid and creating cleaner generation sources that these EVs can use. Looking more long-term, the Clean Power Plan in Missouri is estimated to reduce the state's CO2 emissions 28% by 2030 from 2012 levels by slowly, gradually shifting the state's generation mix to cleaner fuel sources such as natural gas, renewables, using energy efficiency as a resource. And then finally, again, what Dan touched upon was this NRDC EPRI analysis, which shows under a scenario of widespread vehicle transportation electrification, which I believe assumes about half of all vehicle miles traveled in 2050 are electrified, this can yield approximately 430 million GHG tons saved in a base case scenario. And this has pretty substantial impacts for both not only the transportation sector, but also the electricity sector. And by 2050, these emissions can be halved relative to 2015 levels. And that's something, if you saw in Dan's slide, he had already showed. All right, so how does charging infrastructure fit into all of this? As many experts at National Academy of Sciences and others have pointed out, the lack of EV charging infrastructure is still a significant barrier to bringing these cars to market and really accelerating EV growth. And while we are interested in having utilities invest in infrastructure to provide these environmental benefits, there is so much more that these charging stations can do besides environmental benefits that we are absolutely interested in ensuring that these utilities consider. For example, through proper siting, proper load management, etc., these stations can provide fuel cost savings to EV owners, widespread utility customer benefits from improved distribution asset utilization, grid reliability benefits, and also renewables integration benefits. And that'll be increasingly important as KCP&L and others ramp up not only wind procurement, but also solar and other sorts of renewable generation. So I know everyone has sort of seen this already, but I just kind of wanted to give a quick anecdote about sort of a tale of two cities, or a tale of two urban areas. So we have here Dallas-Fort Worth, where utility customers are subject to a flat rate, doesn't vary by time of day. And down below you have SDG&E, which has a time of use rate with a super off-peak period that starts at midnight, as you can see, and probably, I think, goes till 5 or 6 a.m. And in the first case, what you have during weekday charging is, EV drivers coming home around 5 or 6, plugging in, aggravating and exacerbating that evening peak that Ed was just talking about, further creating this sort of vulnerable infrastructure, aggravating peak, potentially risking costly grid upgrades, distribution system upgrades. Whereas in the San Diego gas and electric case, at midnight, when that evening peak has largely died down and there's tons of spare capacity on the grid, these EVs start ramping up and sort of fill in that load gap that comes at evening times when there isn't that much load on the grid. And this is actually a great story for wind, which historically peaks generation later at night, where these EVs can soak up that extra generation and provide a sort of reliability service for this variable intermittent source of power. So yeah, first case bad, second case good. So overall, main takeaways, even despite Missouri's very coal-heavy generation mix, these EVs already provide environmental benefits today. And these vehicles are only getting cleaner over time as, Clean Air Act regulations come into play, the CPP comes into play, more wind contracts are signed, hopefully. And finally, charging station infrastructure is absolutely critical to realizing these benefits in the long term. And because these stations are going to be in the ground for, hopefully 15, 20, 25 years, we should really be thinking seriously about the long-term benefits that these stations can provide. And also designing infrastructure programs in a way that encourage not just environmental benefits, but also these other benefits that I just spoke about that are, by and large, broad public benefits. Thank you.
So we have a few questions. Can you hear me okay? Everybody hear me okay? We have a few questions for the panel, and we'll just go over them and give each person a chance to respond to the questions. How would EV charging networks potentially impact the air quality in the service area? Something for each one of you.
So, I think anyone who's, EV infrastructure is going to enable electric vehicles. I think anyone who's set, especially in dense urban areas, or even not dense urban areas, anyone who's been by the exhaust pipe of a car, electric vehicles don't have, if they're running on the electric, they don't have an exhaust pipe, so, whether it's the air quality or the greenhouse gases itself.
And as far as the actual charging station?
Yeah, you need stations to have the cars, so.
Anyone like to-
Thanks, Sam. Just to piggyback off Dan's response, the air quality impacts are going to be from the car, not the charging station, right? And the extent to the air quality impacts is going to be dependent on the scale that we achieve in terms of electric vehicle penetration. So the key takeaway, I think, when it comes to the infrastructure itself is, are we increasing accessibility in a way that truly lowers barriers to EV adoption. So as to reach scale, so as to reach those environmental benefits that we'd all like to see from electric vehicles, and which form the basis for support from groups like Sierra Club for electric vehicles. But the key is, are we citing the charging stations in such a fashion as they actually enable people to go out and buy an electric vehicle when they could not already, not simply increasing accessibility in those places that, where you might top off your load.
And just to follow up on that point, I think what he means by increasing accessibility is really opening up markets to, or the market in multi-unit dwellings, where apartment owners may not have any incentive to install EV infrastructure, where the building owner is in charge of manning the stations, or where people don't have a dedicated private parking spot. And really opening up that market will be critical, especially in urban areas such as Kansas City. Workplace charging is, widely recognized as the second most popular location where EVs rest during the day. So making sure that infrastructure need is covered will also be critical. And then maybe further down from those two priority areas is sort of a opportunistic or opportunity charging at your Whole Foods or your mall or your hospital or things like that. But really increasing the access to MUD apartment dwellers and workplace charging will absolutely be critical to getting people to buy these EVs and accelerate the market forward.
Okay, do we have any questions from the audience?
I'm Glenn Buck from the Gas Company, and I'm just kind of curious, since we're dealing with the environmental impacts of EV charging stations. You talk about comparisons of the electric vehicles to traditional gasoline fuels. What about electric versus, for example, CNG? Does natural gas have a role in transportation in the future?
All right, so in my previous life before I full disclosure, I worked at Pacific Gas and Electric Company in San Francisco, and I ran their customer-facing electric vehicle and natural gas vehicle team. It's a question we got a lot. So the short answer is, yeah, there's definitely a role for CNG, or even hydrogen. I mean, electric, based on current kind of foreseen technology, if you think about big, heavy things moving long distances, I mean, that's probably not a fuel for, you're not going to drive a truck from New York City to LA on batteries anytime in the foreseeable future. Maybe a plug-in hybrid of some kind where it's, on the open road, it's running off some kind of liquid fuel, and then when it gets to a city, then it switches to the battery to do what it needs to do. So yeah, I think there's definitely an opportunity. And electric vehicles still are, I mean, we have to look on a case-by-case basis as far as what the generation is, but in general, electric vehicles are still even cleaner than CNG. I still think there's, in my opinion, there's still a role for liquid fuels.
One back here.
I have two questions. The first is, I see there's a bullet item under this panel called Clean Power Plan Compliance. And I've been a poles and wire guy all my career, so I don't know the answer to this question. Are electric vehicles among the building blocks that the EPA suggests could be used in a state's compliance with the Clean Power Plan, for one? And the other question I have is, this is for you, Dan. When you showed your EV adoption curve, you had a dotted line superimposed on the bar graph called hybrid adoption or something. What was the purpose of that dotted line superimposed on the electric vehicle bars? Thank you.
No, thanks for the question. So I'll answer the second one first. So that's the historical adoption rate in Missouri of hybrids based off of it. So non-plug-in hybrids, like Toyota Prius of the world, and there were a few others. Over a different time period, yeah. So thank you, I should have explained that. So that just kind of gives an example. That the takeaway is that it's largely matching one-to-one. In some parts of the country, plug-in electric vehicles are 2 to 3 times ahead of what the adoption was for the Prius. But I mean, there are a lot of factors that go into that, whether it's consumer acceptance of the technology, what's available on the dealer lots, things like that. I think one of the things that Toyota did really well is they had their early markets and they kind of rolled it out nationwide. So it's one-to-one right now. The first question that maybe either of these gentlemen know, I know initially when the Green Power Plan was rolled out, electric vehicles were not included, but I'm not sure where it's at today. My dad is old.
So my understanding is the same as Dan's, which is that today electric vehicles are not part of the building blocks achieving compliance with the Clean Power Plan. And their relationship with the Clean Power Plan is a little bit complex. Obviously electric vehicles will increase demand for electricity generation coming from sources that are in fact covered by the Clean Power Plan. Now, whether that impacts the state's compliance is going to matter on whether they choose to approach the Clean Power Plan, if they approach it at all, given the legal complications, but whether they choose to approach it under a mass-based plan or a rate-based plan. Under a rate-based plan, there might be a limited impact from electric vehicle integration. And this is assuming that it was that scale to affect the generation output. Under a mass-based plan, it may change the dynamics for compliance. Now, the one thing to bear in mind is that electric vehicles are neat in that we can control the demand and match it with variable generation. And so, here to utilize and leverage electric vehicle load to further integrate renewables, which Missouri has great potential for. It's 13th most potential for wind energy in the country. And I think I read this morning that you could power 20% of the state's electricity on solar. And so the resources are there, and electric vehicles could be a tool which you leverage among many others to achieve compliance. But it's going to take an individualized assessment for compliance.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add, but yeah, EVs definitely aren't part of any building blocks as part of EPA's approach to the Clean Power Plan. That said, to the extent that they can integrate renewable energy and bring down that barrier to integrating more wind, for example, in the state and solar, that's a huge benefit. And the way we can do that, the few examples that we showed you before, the SDG&E and Dallas graphs, SDG is on a TOU rate, or time of use rate there, but there are already examples of utilities matching real-time wind generation, or real-time renewables generation production, and allowing that to match with EV load, or matching EV load with real-time renewables generation production. This isn't a thing of the future. This is already happening in other utilities, and it's already being explored in other areas. So I think that's one way that EVs can potentially play a role in Clean Power Plan compliance.
There's one more question.
Yeah, I've got two quick questions. One for Dan. He was referenced earlier in the PCPL study for the slide about the open vehicle grid. Is that going to be made available to the public?
The slides are there.
No, the actual report. I mean, I know EPRI's nonprofit, but sometimes there's a fee associated with some of the.
Yeah. So that part of that is funded by the I'll talk about it more this afternoon. But part of that project is funded by the California Energy Commission, so that part of the project will be public. Our intent, my personal intent, is to publicize as much as I can, especially on the broader stuff that applies more broadly.
Any idea when that would be completed?
Well, it's a 10-year project, and we're in like year 4 right now. So some stuff, we've done proof of concept back in October 2014, and now this year, next year's use cases. So I would imagine by the end of next year, as far as chapter 2.
And I've got a. Oh, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to note that in Pacific Gas and Electric's electric vehicle infrastructure related rate case out in California, the Open Grid Vehicle Integration Platform is expressly mentioned in that settlement agreement as one means to achieve the demand response program. And so as part of some of PG&E's filings before the California Public Utilities Commission, there's some fairly extensive information on the platform, I think maybe 50 or 60 pages that you could dig into.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Could you guys speak a little bit to Casper, cross-state air pollution, in the context of this? I mean, one of the concerns that we have is that, yes, emissions are being reduced, urban areas get better, but the emissions are also increasing. They're just increasing in a different place, right, where it's being generated. That's a big concern, in terms of just overall cost. I don't know if it's necessarily something you can answer, but are you aware of any studies that have looked at, the costs that are inherent with that displacement?
I don't know if I can speak to the last part of your question, but as far as Casper goes, yeah, equity is definitely a concern here because, as you're displacing tailpipe emissions, you are increasing coal generation, which does, have those SO2 and NOx emissions in there. The only thing I can sort of point back to is, because of Casper, these emissions have gone down and have gone down rapidly and will likely continue to do so as, the regulation periods continue. But yes, there definitely is an equity concern, and that's something we should be aware of. But back to the study that I had referenced earlier about 50,000 premature deaths nationally from tailpipe emissions, a lot of the most vulnerable populations are in urban areas where all these vehicles are concentrated. So I guess you can point to a sort of shifting of health consequences from urban areas to maybe more rural areas where these coal plants are, but I think you'd have to do a really in-depth analysis to see who's being affected by these coal plant emissions and whether there are environmental justice communities or other low-income communities that are impacted by these emissions. But absolutely something to take into consideration.
So just to add to that on the technology side, so we've been primarily talking about light-duty cars this morning. But also, it's important for all of us to keep in mind there are roughly like 50 other forms of electric transportation, buses, forklifts, seaports. It's all about kind of goods and people movement. So a lot of that equipment is extremely polluting. It's less regulated than, say, a light-duty car. So that some of those technologies, like forklifts, electric forklifts exist today. They're efficient and productive and all that. And some of the stuff, lags it behind, and buses are kind of in the middle. So I guess my point is there's a lot of other technologies out there that could potentially offset some of that. Obviously, there's pollution gains from that generation.
Okay, let's give our speakers a round of applause, please. And we will have lunch on our own today, so that's thanks to everybody, and we'll come back after lunch and start by taking
1:30.
1:30.
I was going to guess I've got a couple notes here. I saw sure.
Alright, this afternoon panel is going to go over project funding and how electric vehicle charging stations should be funded, if that should be ratepayer, and what kind of federal and state incentives there are. My panel today includes Barb Meisenhardt. She joined the Division of Energy in October 2014 and currently oversees the Energy Policy and Resources Group. Prior to joining DE, Ms. Meisenhardt served as the Chief Economics at the Office of Public Counsel. We also have James Owen, who joined us in February, so he assumed the role of acting public counsel. Mr. Owen has had a varied career. He has served as an associate circuit judge for Webster County, 8 years of practice in probate law, and also helped the Missouri Office of Administration develop a contract oversight office. Finally, we have Mr. Darren Ives. He works as the Vice President of Kansas City Power and Light in the Regulatory Affairs Division, which oversees development and administration of pricing, rates, rules, regulations, and tariff filings. Seems like pretty much everything you guys do. He joined KCPL in 1996 and is a certified public accountant in Kansas and Missouri. So they're going to give a brief 10-minute presentation, and then we will open it up to questions, all right?
Good morning, afternoon. I haven't eaten lunch yet, so it's afternoon, or it's still morning for me. First of all, earlier in the presentations this morning, we heard a great deal about the potential benefits of EV charging stations as a way to facilitate EV vehicle deployment in the state. overall emissions reductions that currently could occur and could occur in the future. We also heard about the diversification of our transportation options, the potential to more fully use our utility infrastructure. In addition, we believe at the Division of Energy that there are great opportunities for economic development, that deploying EVs and the EV infrastructure to support them can encourage identification of our state and our region as really an innovative place for energy businesses to locate. It can also create additional jobs, and it can promote greater economic growth in the specific areas served by these facilities. In addition, something that I'm not sure was discussed at length this morning was the opportunity for improved energy security. Currently, Missouri imports virtually all of its energy resources, and by converting to increased portfolio of renewable energy, we can improve our energy security from supply events that might disrupt those supplies. It also can be an opportunity for us to become more reliant on in-state generation. One of the other things that was discussed this morning and I wanted to touch on was discussion about the flexibility of EV load control to address intermittency of renewable energy resources, and that as well can certainly benefit and improve the likelihood that we're going to increase our representation of renewable energies in our portfolio. I'm here primarily to address issues of funding and sponsorship options for EV infrastructure development. I'll discuss investor-owned utilities' role, independent providers, the role of independent providers. I will also, in addition to those participating directly in the market, I'll talk about some federal and state initiatives to increase the availability of infrastructure to serve EV vehicles. Obviously, I should have someone else doing the clicker. Okay. All right. So, from my perspective, I feel that these EV charging stations and the electricity provided through them provides the same or similar service to what our electric utilities already offer for other uses. EV charging stations offer an opportunity to fully support the use of our electric distribution plant, especially under proper rate design at times when there is underutilization of those facilities. Utilities are well positioned to benefit this effort by capitalizing on the economies of scale that they already enjoy. And they're currently the only entity certified to sell electricity from their grid to the public in their service territories. There are a number of things that we need to be addressing, and I think now this effort that the staff has undertaken to hold this workshop, I think is a great first step in this effort. I think that we need to continue down this path. We need to address things such as how do we develop rates, and in particular cost-based rates for these services, and how are we going to design electric vehicle charging specific tariffs. I mentioned when we first had the first policy discussion this morning that I saw similarities between this effort and the design of rates for the payphone industry and the development of the payphone industry. And so some of these issues that have come up, I think that in telecommunications, we actually have addressed these issues to some extent, and I see some similarities. So, for example, we have in the past designed tariffs that accommodate either utility ownership or host site ownership of equipment. We have also addressed in the past issues with host site pays or end user pays. And from my perspective, I think there is a great benefit to trying to allow flexibility for both end user pay options as well as host site pays options. It may be that host sites find a value in continuing to provide as part of their packages of conveniences to the customers, to their patrons, the opportunity to charge while they're parked at the mall, while they are visiting an entertainment venue. So I hope that as we move forward in identifying tariff structures, that we keep those things in mind and allow for the opportunity for either type of rate to apply. We may also need to deal with the issue of, obviously, how do you define what a customer is? Do we need a separate customer class to allocate these costs in proper ways? Time differentiated rates is going to be key to ensuring that EV development is actually a benefit to use of the electric grid and to ultimately result in benefit, I think, to ratepayers. We have identified that there are actually a number of specific incentives and tariffs offered by utilities outside of Missouri, and you can find examples of those at the Alternative Fuels Data Center website. I think I have an actual link to that later in the presentation. Independent providers also will play a role. Utility territory certificates do not confer an exclusive franchise. Independent providers that are generating with their own facilities and providing for their own use and for the use of tenants is one way that independent providers may find themselves in the market. There's also an issue in the future down the road about whether utility tariffs currently may prevent resale of charging, but do we want them to? I know that with gas, with our compressed natural gas tariff for vehicular fuel, you actually have the option where you will sell the natural gas and that customer may compress it and be a reseller of that service. So that already actually exists in the state. Will we need to create a structure by which independent providers would have to apply for and receive certificates of convenience and necessity? How will they be required to file tariffs? And to what extent do we need to review our regulatory, our current regulations and tariffs to accommodate those changes? I want to talk a little bit about the FAST Act. Section 1413 requires the Federal Highway Administration to designate alternative vehicle corridors and identify the long-term infrastructure needs. Also within the FAST Act, it addresses the congestion mitigation and air quality improvement program and specifically adds eligibility for EV and compressed natural gas corridors. Work to develop those corridor designations is currently underway, It needs to be completed by December 2016 on the current schedule. There are opportunities for comment, and you can find more about that implementation at the website provided. One of the things that I found particularly interesting about the fact that the FAST Act, Section 1413, Part C, is that it specifically allows for charging of private vehicles on federally controlled property, and that charging is to be provided at to recover the cost of the facilities. And of course, it's not to interfere with fueling the fleet, the federally owned fleet. Let's see. Clean Cities Coalition, we're going to hear from later, that has been instrumental in trying to work to develop infrastructure in our metropolitan areas. I think Ameren, Missouri may have worked with St. Louis Clean Cities Coalition to identify placement for infrastructure. Also, on the Kansas City side of the state, Clean Cities Coalition was instrumental in bringing about ARA funds to initiate placement of charging infrastructure. There's also a Heartland Plan going on in Kansas City, and that's available online. I want to talk briefly about the Missouri Alternative Fuel Infrastructure Tax Credit. In the state of Missouri, you can get an income tax credit, up to $1,500 for individuals, up to 20% or $20,000 for businesses. It can be carried forward for 2 years, transferred or sold. It applies to a variety of alternative fuel infrastructure, and it will expire on 1/1/18. In Missouri, the Division of Energy actually verifies the expenditures under and applications for this tax credit. And so far, 12 of our 13 applications in 2015 were for EV charging. 10 were residential applications. 2 were from utilities for a total of 5 charging stations, and I believe all of those are level 2 charging stations. Those combined represented about half of the appropriation for 2015. There's about $30,000 remaining that can be used. In 2016, the appropriation is falling to $50,000. Other federal options, there's also a federal alternative fuel infrastructure tax credit. It is only in place until the end of 2016. Residential can qualify for up to $1,000, business 30% or up to $30,000. There are also options for government entities, public transportation providers, higher education institutions for low and zero emissions vehicle research under the low and zero emissions vehicle research demonstration and deployment funding. Finally, for airport zero emissions vehicle and infrastructure incentives, they would be required to be public use airports. There's priority for non-attainment areas, and the funding would be to install or modify fueling infrastructure to support eligible zero emissions vehicles. So those are some of the opportunities out there to help support the deployment of this infrastructure. And if I can provide any follow-up information that would be helpful, please let me know, and I'm looking forward to participating in the discussion. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I never have to ask if anyone can hear me, but I'm going to make sure that everyone's back. Everyone get me all right over there? All right, good. Okay, I want to first start by thanking our moderator for her generous comments about me, saying I had a varied career. That's a nice way of saying I can't hold a job. So I appreciate her putting it like that. name is James Owen. I am the acting director of the Office of Public Counsel, and we're here today on behalf of the public. By statute, that is who we represent for the Public Service Commission, for the appellate courts, and for any other appropriate venues. And we are elated to be a part of this process. We are very happy that all of you are taking time out of your busy schedules and some of the urgent matters you have to attend to be here with us. And we're really hoping that we can be a productive participant in this ongoing discussion. We kind of talked a little bit earlier when we were discussing the legalities of whether or not the Public Service Commission can be involved with this kind of process, and whether the policy rationales for that involvement. And our table over there, the public counsel table, we talked, to some extent about what our position there is. I don't want to dwell on it too much because we've already talked about it, but I think it's worth repeating again just before we get to how we can do this. I think it's a matter of getting to the ability. And I mean, ultimately, when you look at what the Public Service Commission does, yes, they regulate utilities. And I think what the investor-owned utilities argue, and I think they argue quite well, is that any aspect of what they do and what they provide should fall under that auspice. There is some logic to that. However, I think that it's important to bear out that there was a constant theme that keeps going on between all the speakers that have been up here, is that this is an emerging market, this is a growing market, this is a burgeoning market. There's going to be more of these cars out there, there's going to be more people driving them, there's going to be more people that are dealing with them, and there's going to be more of a demand. And so right now, as far as whether or not this market needs the kind of regulatory oversight that we're discussing here, whether that's a necessity or not, it's hard to say. And the reality is, how do we know that there's not going to be the ability for other industries or free market parties to come in and actually be able to provide these services? We don't know. And we don't know that yet. I mean, so we have a lot of unknowns. We can certainly forecast, we can certainly look at it. There's a lot of smart people in this room who have a lot of data and information, and they try to predict the future, but it's hard to say. And what our concern would be, from a consumer perspective, is this regulatory process going to be what protects consumers the most? Or is it going to be the fact that you have other people competing for this market that's going to actually have those natural factors in place? It's hard to say. And right now, I think you look at the fact there are private entities involved with this, not just the fact that KCP&L is contracted with a private third party. I mean, certainly that is kind of more of a partnership than anything else. But you look at car dealers, they do this. You look at other areas where ChargePoint throughout the state and other entities throughout the state have these kind of EV chargers. Obviously ChargePoint can dispute this, but according to their website, when we looked at it, there are over 1,000 of these ports in Missouri. 714 of them are ran under the ChargePoint network. I mean, I don't have any details about who runs those, where they are, but they're not all within the Kansas City. They're not all in the KCP&L service market. So we know they're out there. We know that they're in areas that aren't necessarily covered by any investor-owned utilities. Springfield, Missouri is a good example of that. That's my home base. They don't have an investor-owned utility that runs electricity there. It's a municipal utility, but there's 5 or 6 of them there. And I'm sure ChargePoint, according to the map on their website, has partnerships down there. And so that's not necessarily something that's going to necessarily put these things hand in hand, as an argument has been made here today. So that's something that we got to factor in. And obviously we talk about those. We also deal with the fact that according to some studies out there, 85% of people who use these charge them in their own home. And obviously that is going to be a factor as far as what impact it has on the grid. It's certainly going to be an impact on what it has on how investor-owned utilities all throughout the state have to deal with this. But I mean, certainly there's that option as well. So I mean, we do have a number of things that people already have those options. And of course, as we also mentioned, when you're talking about whether or not these are going to be considered part of the utility, we're going to consider these a plant, and they're going to be part of a rate case. I mean, I think that is what, one of the things they've already been. Part lot of rate cases in the past. I know the Public Service Commission's already dealt with this to a certain level. And from our perspective, as we talked about a little bit today, we do have concerns as a consumer watch group, or as a office that's supposed to be watching after ratepayers, that the person who's out there, and I know this is hard for a lot of people in this room to contemplate, but there are people in the state who live off of $600-700 a month, and that's a fixed income. And they oftentimes have to make a decision about paying their electric bill. They have to make a decision about how they're going to pay for their groceries. They got to make a decision about how they pay for their medical bills. These are serious, dire consequences for them. And anytime you have any kind of rate increase, you have to ask yourself, what benefit is it to them? I mean, while I know what the altruistic and I know what the policy benefits that we discuss here are, you have to look at those individuals. And that's one of the things that the statute say our office has to do. And say, is this something that is going to benefit them ultimately? Some of these people don't drive. Some of these people have real needs. And we need to be mindful of that every time we consider bringing them into that equation. And that's just something I want everyone in this room to think about. It's hard to, and it's easy to look at it in abstract terms. This is a real situation out there. And it's just something that we've got to be mindful of. And ultimately, with the continued innovation, if we allow this market to continue to emerge, as we've discussed, it's still growing, it's still building. We have to ask ourselves, well, is this going to be a situation where we have these things put up, and then all of a sudden the demand for them move? I mean, we're talking about people driving cars. And this is, by its inherent nature, something that is kind of not a fixed value for a certain geographic area. If there's an incentive for individuals to build these where they can be moved around, they can be mobile. I mean, that's certainly something that for the folks here who are working in utilities to consider. Is this something that is going to be able to be something where if one's not being used somewhere, it can be used somewhere else? And if that's not the case, and we have these things that are mobile, even outside of the regular rate cycle, is this going to be something where then all of a sudden we put these things up, we put money into them, and all of a sudden they get asked to be a stranded asset the next time the Public Service Commission looks at it? And that's a concern we've got, that we're going to put all this money into it, and that we're going to make all these, that we're going to put all this capital into it, and then all of a sudden it's not going to be something that is going to be useful for the public, and that's a concern we've got. And I kind of I certainly went through some of those issues, why it shouldn't be considered part of why it should not be considered part of the utilities' normal services and products. We've already went over a lot of that. But I think it does bear to ask the question of, when it comes down to who's responsible for this. And one thing, I don't know if it's possible, it's something that's up for debate, but whether or not that the actual drivers themselves should be responsible for these costs. I mean, why is that not something that we can talk about here? Why is that not something that we're looking at if it's a direct benefit to the person that's using the electronic vehicle? I mean, the EV, whatever it is, a car, truck, whatever. Why are they not the ones that are going to be responsible for that? That's just something we want to throw out there. We're not saying that's what should be done. We're not saying that can be done. We're just asking the question. But let's forget all that for a second. Let's talk about if the Public Service Commission did see this as something that they could regulate. Or let's say that, as some of the other people who have talked here today have said, that the legislature could potentially make this a part of the Public Service Commission's regulatory obligations. I mean, that's certainly a very distinct possibility. How do we want it done? And I think that there are a lot of things that we can talk about from our perspective that we'd like for that to be considered, if that is something, if it goes in that direction. And that ultimately has to be something that benefits not only the ratepayer, has to benefit the grid, and it has to benefit the people who are driving. It has to benefit everybody. That's what the Public Service Commission's got to look like. I don't work for them. We only appear in front of them, so I won't want to speak for them directly, but that's what would have to be balanced. And when our office looked at this issue, we see a lot of value in doing a good time of use rate, where it would try to encourage these drivers to charge up at night during those off-peak hours, where that would encourage this not to have that much of an impact on the general rate-paying public. We also think that would certainly have a less, a less, a less detrimental effect on the grid. We think that's important. I mean, I think even looking at a volumetric tier to EV charging rates is certainly something that we think is certainly worth talking about. However, we understand those are not common. We understand those are complex. We deal with uncommon, complex issues all the time in utility regulations, so that's something to keep in mind. That's an issue, that's a concept out there that's really important. And then ultimately, you have to look at, well, how have other states dealt with this? If anything, one thing they teach you about being a lawyer is it's always okay to plagiarize in these cases. And so if you see another state or you see another entity, I really thought that plagiarism joke was going to make more of a laugh, so I'm sorry. How have they handled it? How have these other states handled it? And I mean, there's not exactly a state like Missouri that has necessarily went through this. There's states that are on the coast. There are states that are, different in size, different in geographic, in geographic range. And they're not exactly apples and apples. We're talking a little bit of apple and oranges. But when you look at what Oregon's done, the entity out there decided these charging stations are non-regulated, non-rate-based ventures, but would be subject to regulation if they operate above the line. That was that order there. I have that one there. I don't have it on all the other ones because I was running out of space, so I can certainly get those references for you after we're done here. The one I really like, in Massachusetts, the commission determined that costs are recoverable only if the utility can demonstrate that services are in the public interest, meeting a need not being met by non-utility providers, and utility participation is not hindering development of a competitive vehicle market. And I think when you talk about our concerns, you talk about our issues with it, I think that certainly is one that allows the Public Service Commission a lot of deference, and I think it gives them a lot of things to analyze. And I certainly think that's something that, while, like I said, Massachusetts might not be exactly like Missouri, and the behavior of drivers might be a little different, it's certainly something I think is worth exploring if we go down that route. Not an endorsement, just something to think about. Hawaii, the commission approved tariffs containing 5-year charging station pilot programs, implying that the utilities will seek recovery of costs. That's how Hawaii done it. Arizona, at the commission's direction, utility developed an EV readiness demonstration project that included rate incentivization for off-peak home charging and public charging stations. And there, the commission refined the latter so that it was completely unrecoverable. So that's how they handled it. In Washington State, that's Washington State, not Washington, D.C., they changed the statutes, and that's something that we talked about. A couple people this morning talked about needing a change to the statutory scheme that the Public Service Commission works under. Where EV charging stations provided by utilities are regulated and incorporated into the rate base, while those provided by other entities are unregulated. That's what Washington State did. 1 minute? 5 minutes. Okay, sorry, I don't have my glasses on, forgive me. So that's what some other states have done. This is not something that has been tested in a lot of other states. I know that that there is an incentive sometimes for us to be safe, be cautious. In this event, while it might take a couple of years, and there's going to be other states that start veering into that direction, we don't have a lot to look after if that's where we're going to go. But as far as innovations, without these being part of an overall rate base, we talked about this earlier, these charging stations can be built, possibly removed, proportional demand rather than being dependent on a periodic cycle of rate case by an entity that may have motivation to build more stations than is necessary. I mean, that's a concern we've got. I mean, that this is going to lead to, if this is something that's part of the rate base, we're going to start seeing more of these built than is necessary. And that's just a concern that we've always got going into these kind of cases, and it's one that we want people to be mindful of in the future when we're talking about it from a ratepayer perspective. But we also believe that if this was regulated, a TOU, we always like to say those, we always have these TLAs. I believe Lewis Mills, one of my predecessors, said you're going to come across a lot of those. Asked him what a TLA was, and he said, well, that's a 3-letter acronym. We can make a 3-letter acronym out of almost anything in this job. That rate would be important not only to encourage economical charging behavior, but to minimize peak demand on the grid and potentially the need for further transmission and distribution expenditures. So I think that if the Public Service Commission did see this as part of their obligation of the statute, if the legislature saw fit to make the Public Service Commission look at these things depending on how all that works out, and I think that's certainly the one driving thing that the Office of Public Counsel would like for everyone involved with this, all the interested stakeholders to keep in mind and be cognizant of when they're making these decisions. And really, that's really the only thoughts that we want to have with you this afternoon. Certainly, we've done a lot of research. I will give a lot of credit to our economist, Jeff Mark, and our research guru, Rich Burge, who really did a lot to put this together from our office. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for your time.
Good afternoon. As mentioned, my name is Darren Ives. I'm the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for Kansas City Power and Light. I'm excited to be here this afternoon talking about EV charging stations. Appreciate the opportunity to speak from the Commission and the staff today. Maybe just briefly, Barb touched on it better than I could, but federal and state incentives. I think the only comment I would make on that, that's not really what I'm here to talk about today, but the comment I'd make on that is, with the benefits that have been described today that come from the adoption of EVs and the accelerated adoption of EVs that the charging station deployment can bring, I think it makes some sense to evaluate federal and state incentives to spur that adoption. I think we've seen it in this industry in a number of other circumstances, and it could easily continue to be of importance for EV. But in general, I'm going to spend the time talking about EV charging station, how they're funded, cost recovery options, as a bulk of my discussion. The outline is up there. Before getting into details, I think it's important to reiterate what many have said today, that this really is an emerging market, particularly in the Midwest. I think it's reasonable to consider cost recovery approaches a little bit different than just a cost-based formula when you're dealing with an emerging issue, emerging market like this, and we've seen it happen before in the industry. And I think in light of all the benefits that we've heard about today that could be unlocked by having the infrastructure in place to accelerate adoption, it makes a lot of sense. We'll talk about utility-owned EV charging stations. I'll start with that first since that's really my background. Funding, we have, as everybody knows, set out on an effort to deploy over 1,000 charging stations across our service territories, and well over halfway deployed at this point. Funding has happened for us, typical to how a utility investment happens for us today. We've made the investment, shareholders have funded it. It will be incumbent upon us to come in and deal with recovery issues as the investments are used and useful in service and in service. Certainly appreciative of the workshop forum here in Missouri to continue thought and continue the evolution in the state of Missouri. We're also working on a similar path in Kansas as we get stakeholder involvement, engagement, working towards that longer term recovery solution. Recovery options, though, things to think about in that arena. Recovery. You've got to send the appropriate price signals when you're talking about recovery for electric vehicles, putting out a set of stations and having it be cost prohibitive for users to take advantage of those stations, having it do just the opposite than what we're hoping to unlock, which is kind of dispelling the concerns about range anxiety, but having that not be available to folks because we've put an out of market price on that would not be good for the unlocking of the benefits that we've talked about. You can have the cost paid by the EV user or the host site. We've talked about here that in the early stages of our rollout, we have had the electricity funded by the host sites as we've started our rollout, but the long-term solution we are hopeful is to have the investments treated as utility investments and have a rate for individual users to pay for the electricity coming out of the service. You know, we are going to see, and you saw some fantastic charts earlier today on kind of the rapid adoption that has occurred just in the time since we started rolling out the charging stations, you know, as far as usage of the charging stations, overall vehicle adoption in our service territory, and as we continue to have the revenues from those additional charging, you know, the charging station uses, it's going to help to offset cost incurred to put the system, put the charging station in place. Something to consider, and I think maybe James alluded to this a little bit ago, you know, 75 to 80% of the charging occurs at the home base, but when you're putting in a backbone at a utility scale level, you're really unlocking the early adoption of the vehicles and creating some of that additional usage. And we all know it makes sense to maximize utilization of a system like a public electric utility that is historically underutilized because we're built to peak demand. That if we can find a way, such as additional kilowatt-hour cells from EVs, to bulk up and use those off-peak times, it's going to generate more kilowatt-hours. It's going to spread the fixed cost of our system over that higher level of kilowatt-hours, which is a natural benefit to all of our customers, including those that James mentioned. We ought to be thinking about the effect on their rates. You know, so I think it makes sense as we explore cost recovery options that we consider that home-based charging and some ratio of that home-based charging being reflected as a benefit of the utility scale charging station infrastructure that's been put in place, because that backbone, that pilot backbone that we're putting in really is accelerating the adoption and the use of that home-based charging. You know, I think there may be, because of the emerging state of EV charging, and I mentioned this earlier, there may be some sense in socializing or spreading some of that cost across all of the customers, primarily reflective of a lot of the more global benefits that we've talked about. So those are things that we need to consider as we sit down and think about how we look at pricing. Non-utility EV charging stations, I think there is a role for non-utility charging stations at the right time. There are some things that we need to consider as a state at this point before we really open up that market. We've touched on those. Barb did, and I think James did as well. And we need to think about the resale electricity and the way the rules and tariffs are in the state today. We need to work through that issue as we move forward. I think we'll have to really consider the benefits or the difference in benefits that are unlocked by non-utility charging stations compared to utility. You heard some discussion today, but having an integrated set of stations that the utility manages and controls, you know, not only unlocks the benefits of having the placement on the grid and the understanding on the impacts of the grid where we put it in, but it also has some of the demand response benefits where we can call on those stations to scale down utilization of those stations or output to those stations in times of need and, you know, for peak load requirements. That is something that would be very hard for us to unlock those types of benefits if we have, you know, a large pool of random third parties putting up non-integrated stations across our service territory to serve their personal benefits. You know, and I think we also got to look at some of the extension policies. You know, we have policies in place today of you know, the cost that the utility will pay for the revenues that a new service will provide. And I think we may need to look and see if we need extension policies kind of tailored specifically to this new emerging market and evaluating, you know, kind of at this level how we look at that as we start to consider non-utility owned EV charging stations. All that said, though, I think, and Chuck will probably tell you when he's up later, I think we view our position in this market at this time as kind of knocking down that range anxiety and being the backbone of the core infrastructure that will accelerate adoption. We don't see it as precluding over the long haul third-party investment in charging station infrastructure in our service territory. You know, I think just to wrap up briefly, you know, there are a lot of benefits that can be unlocked by the adoption of EVs. You've heard a lot today. You'll hear some more when the afternoon panels come up. You know, providing and paying for infrastructure, it's got to be done right. We think we have a good model. We've done a lot of research, obviously, and looked at how things have gone across the country, and we think kind of this targeted near-term investment by the utility to move the market forward is a good place to be a good kickstart here. There probably are some uncomfortable risks and issues. I think James alluded to it. I mean, there may be some very complex topics that we need to cover over the coming sessions that we're together and over the coming years in this area. It's not uncommon in the regulated utility space, and I think we're all probably up for it and can tackle it. But I think we've seen enough today, and we'll continue to see that there's a pretty strong signal that electrification of the transportation sector is probably only accelerating from here. I think with that, we probably all take questions.
All right, we have about 15 minutes for some questions from the audience. Anybody have any?
ChargePoint. I just wanted to address some of the points made about policies in other states. I think the list was a bit selective in terms of the parts of the different legislations and statutes provided. I'd be happy to provide more details. But I think it's important to note that in the past 6 months, we've seen states pass new laws stating that it is an appropriate role for the utility to be able to rate-based charging infrastructure so long as it met a number of requirements, including providing grid benefits, which Casey Hill has done, as well as protect competition and allow for customer choice. And I think that that language should be incorporated into any sort of review of the statute currently passed. There's a lot of copy and paste that could be done from Utah, Oregon, Washington, California. We've got open legislation right now in Minnesota, and a number of other states have provided more details, I think, than just listed there. So I would just encourage that all of the details included of those programs be part of what you're filing.
Well, I'm not sure if there's a question there, but yeah, I mean, obviously, we're looking at standards that we believe are mindful of consumers. And when we talk about, I mean, I think you mentioned Oregon, we did talk about Oregon.
That was the thing you referenced there, though, was overturned by the law passed in March.
Okay, well, and I don't know anything about that. I mean, you probably know more about that than I do, and so if you have that information, I'll be happy to look at it.
Sure.
But looking at California, yes, I have information that utilities are authorized to solicit customers who are willing to host charging stations, which are then recoverable, and the CEC administers grants to support the development of EV charging infrastructure, and public utilities offer rebates to its customers for EV charges. Investor-owned utilities may fund EV infrastructure through certain rate-funded initiatives. There is some variation between the different utility programs there. I mean, you're talking about grants, some involving rate-funded initiatives. Now, if you're talking, hold on, let me finish. Now, when you're talking about this being this general public policy idea, and you're talking about this being something that environmental folks, investor-owned utilities, their third-party vendors, those people that are interested in, you're talking about that sort of thing, and you're talking about whether or not that's going to come from ratepayers exclusively, or that's going to come from, you know, the money that they're able to have as part of their profit, or you're talking about that coming from taxpayers. And those are three different types of things. And, you know, when we're talking about like whether or not this is something that's for the broader general policy of this state or this country, I mean, certainly I think talking to the legislature about that is certainly well within anyone's rights as an investor-owned utility or any of their affiliated parties to do so. Now, whether or not you're going to get any receptivity from there, I don't know. That's going to be up to what that body wants to do in the upcoming years. It's certainly something that would be encouraged from our perspective rather than, as I've said before, requiring people who are not using this directly, who are looking at having a very fixed income, and having to say to them, as I said earlier, to you, who is making on average $46,000 a year in your household, you have to go subsidize this person. And I think I misspoke earlier when I said it was $177,000 a year for someone who buys an electric Ford Focus. It's actually $199,000 as I looked at my notes later. It is hard for me to fathom saying to that person at the lower end of that you should have to subsidize this person at the higher end.
I drive an EV. I don't make $199,000. My lease is $185 a month. Go for it. I would just again say that also is an outdated California reference. SB 350 was updated last year and requires the utilities to file multi-year applications to rate-based charging infrastructure, so long as it provides support for disadvantaged communities and also provides benefits, maximum benefits to ratepayers. I can provide the links and statutes into the docket. Thank you.
If anybody else has information about other state laws, statutes, regulations, changes, if you could file that in our electronic filing system, that would be a great help to all of us here. I think we're going to open it up more towards, to facilitate a dialogue we should take for it instead of rehashing what other states are doing at this moment, because we're running out of a little bit of time, but we do thank you for your input.
Thank you. I'm Dr. McLeod again. Kind of curious, got a bit direct one to Ms. Rags and one to Ms. Garland. The first one would be Ms. Rags. How do you see the fallout of this to be? A combination of the end user actually contributing something to a credit card at the charging station, partially rate-basing or fully rate-basing the cost and having it socialized across all of the customers and having the end user paying something towards the fixed cost of the station itself? Is that kind of the model KCL is looking towards?
Yeah, so I think part of that is part of that's what we're getting input and working through in forums like this, right? I mean, if you ask me where I think we'll ultimately end up, I think it makes sense to rate base the investment at the charging station as a service that's kind of unlocking a number of grid level benefits that everybody's going to benefit from, including the additional kilowatt hour cells that are going to be spreading fixed cost over those new kilowatts. I do think that, the stations will be accessible by the end user. They'll pay a tariff-based fee for the service off of that station. And I think somebody mentioned it earlier today, but I think what will be important as we work through to the finish line on this deal will be, working in the type of flexibility that's going to allow a different range of payment options based on this new mobile customer. I mean, if the EV user, may need to use card service directly at the station. It was mentioned earlier, host sites may believe it's important to continue to pay for the service and the electricity for customers because it's bringing their customers into their location. So I think as we work through it, we need to keep kind of that mobile customer flexibility in mind as we set those rates moving forward.
Okay, and then Mr. Owen, if I might. When you started talking at the very beginning of your discussion with us, you talked about the person who's making $600 or $700 a month and may never drive. That kind of resonates with me. I've got my mother-in-law, fits the bill. Single woman on Social Security, never drives a car. So yes, I understand that situation, but don't you run into an issue if you're targeting to only the person who makes $600 or $700 a month, to the point where the people are making more than that are looking for infrastructure that is available to them, because you have to keep your costs down at the level so that person can afford rates $600 or $700 a month?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not saying that we should start having discriminatory policies as far as low income, as far as having low income rate bases and that sort of thing. I mean, that's not what I'm advocating for here. I only bring that up because I think that when we start talking about big policy issues, when we start talking about these kind of long-term issues, it's important for me to express to people who are also stakeholders in this, be mindful of those individuals. I think it can get forgotten sometimes. I mean, certainly I know a lot of people in here have personal experiences with that. Their families have that. Could be that people that are important in their lives otherwise have that situation. But for me, coming from the background I have, where I did a lot of work with public administrator offices, I mean, these are the people that I've worked with a lot in my career. And it's certainly one of those things that when we're looking at a rate increase, whether it be electricity, gas, water, whatever it is, it's certainly something that I always try to be mindful of. And it's not something I'd say that we dictate our entire policy, but when we're looking at this as whether or not it's going to be something that ratepayers should have to pay, or it should be something that we need to see how the emerging markets treat this. I mean, if this is something that ultimately will show that there is a competition for this, and that there are other parties that will be involved with this that aren't just ChargePoint that are affiliated with a utility company. I think that's certainly something we have to be mindful of, that might end up being itself, as opposed to giving those companies a natural advantage over these other free market players. That's just one thing that I just think it's important to keep in mind as we have these discussions. That's all. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
I think we have time for just one more question, so no pressure, make it a really good one. Okay, or too much pressure. I did. Well, I'd like to thank our panelists one more time for their presentations.
If the next panelists can come on up, we have B2G.
Yeah, it's titled VGI.
VGI?
Yeah.
shares and musical materials. Thank you was not very specific.
Good afternoon, my name is Michael Solomon. I'm here to introduce the panelists, Joe Haslow and Dan Bowermeister. Unfortunately, one of our panel members was not able to make it today. Mr. Lagro, though, has informed me that he's going to try to submit his presentation via EFIS. So, for the first panelist, if you'd like to start presenting.
We're gonna wait and
See which one's open.
who wins and who doesn't. All right, everyone. Joe also again from Sierra Club. Thank you for having me up here a second time. I'll do my very best not to duplicate what I said earlier, although I will cover some of the same similar topics as we talk about vehicle grid integration. So first, I want to do a clarification of terms, because I know that a lot have been used this morning, and I find this hierarchy to be helpful, although Dan might have one of you wishes to offer as well. Vehicle grid integration speaks broadly to scheduling or planning or varying EV charging in order to reduce grid impacts or to create benefits. And underneath that, there are at least three means by which to achieve that. One is rate design. We've talked a lot today about time of use rates. That's simply one of many time varying rates that can be used to influence charging behavior, to optimize charging load on the grid. V1G is using communications with vehicles in order to affect demand response, unidirectional demand response. So that would be varying charging load by fluctuating power supply, which we also talked about today. Some other techniques in order to, whereby an EV driver cedes some level of control to the utility or third party in exchange for compensation for them to be available to respond to demand response events. And then the third, which is V to G, which I know is the stated focus of today's panel, although we've heard this morning that V to G is future technology in some ways, and I have to say, to an extent, I agree with that assessment. So several steps to take here in terms of integrating vehicles with the grid. First and foremost is where we're going to be charging. And we've heard this before, but the vast majority of charging occurs at home, and also home charging, access to home charging is characterized as a virtual necessity for EV ownership. If people are going to be, if we're going to make it possible for someone to go out and buy an electric vehicle that otherwise couldn't, one thing that they need to have is home charging. So this pyramid tries to illustrate the various tiers and necessities of charging, starting with home, and then workplace to extend electric miles driven for charging during the day, and so on up through intra and intercity DC fast charging applications. Because the vast majority of charging happens at home, that's the location we should really be targeting first and foremost for integrating EV charging into the grid, particularly because charging at home happens overnight, so we can really utilize low-cost integration with the grid and hopefully have a depressive effect on electricity rates by making use of low-cost power and utilizing underutilized system assets. Again, here's some of the effects of rate design. We've seen this before, so I'm going to move quickly through here. But again, the slide is an illustration from the EV project, which looked at thousands of EV users in, I think, 18 locations across the country to see the effect of rates on charging behavior. So we have 2 locations on the left-hand side with time of use rates, 2 on the right without. You can see that on the right, charging behavior is not controlled, and the peak corresponds to what we expect to see as a data demand curve. Here is an illustration of some examples of time variant rate design. Okay, real-time pricing or dynamic pricing, that is not a thing of the future. In California, San Diego Gas and Electric's program incorporates dynamic pricing on a day-ahead rate to anticipate grid conditions, to offer EV drivers the ability to program parameters for pricing that will correspond with what they expect electricity costs would be the next day, making it easy and possible to integrate low-cost renewable energy. Use pricing is more of a blunt instrument, but it can try to track grid conditions and is in many ways an effective way to incentivize charging at night. And variable peak pricing is one of several ways to deal with compensation for demand response events. So there's some ways in which demand response and rate design overlap in vehicle grid integration. As I stated, the way that demand response typically works here is the EV driver will seize the level of control to a third party or to the utility, who will aggregate a number of vehicles who are participating in the program. One example is Pacific Gas and Electric's pilot program with BMW, where they pay drivers up front in order to participate in the program, and they would compensate them afterwards for their participation, but also based on how many events they participated in. During the course of the program, PG&E would send out an alert to an EV driver that a demand response event was occurring. If the driver elected to participate, the driver would have information on how long it would last, how it affected their charging, and would have certain parameters to ensure a minimum level of charge for their vehicle. And then they elect whether or not to participate. People ask me about demand response. Well, is that going to mean that when I get to my car at the end of the workday that I can't get home? And almost all the demand response program, or every demand response pilot that I'm aware of, specifically accounts for needing a minimum level of charge to do what you need to do during the day. B2G, vehicle to grid, which implicates bi-directional applications for ancillary benefits or actual power flow back to the grid. There are at least 4 Department of Defense pilot programs on this, and a number more. I'll let Dan speak to it further, because I know Every has a large role in affecting B2G as carrying out a fairly sizable pilot. But as far as application today, it's very much limited to pilots and demonstrations that work on hardware and software and a variety of other elements. And then I just wanted to do an illustrative slide for ratepayer impacts. It is possible, by spreading utilities' fixed costs across greater electricity sales, to have a depressive effect on rates if you achieve a certain scale in electric vehicles. This is system-specific, this is state-specific, and we've seen research in California, statewide, we've seen research nationwide from Pacific National Labs, and we've seen it in certain utility areas. KCP&L actually has done a scope analysis on this as well, that shows what scale is necessary in order to have a depressive effect. And you can also have a couple concerns here, one of which is what is the cost of generation going to be for your new vehicle load, which can be decreased by time of use pricing, so you're balancing what your net revenue is going to be against your fixed costs and generation costs. But it is possible to achieve net benefits, which could be applied however they're going to be applied. And then finally, I wanted to clarify Sierra Club's position here, which is that we think the PSC should practically support growth and utility involvement, so long as utilities demonstrate benefits to the grid, EV drivers, and this is the critical piece, the body of utility customers. And that comes through depressive effect on rates, system efficiency, increased system reliability. And we're looking to evaluate the program. We want to see some of the elements I've discussed here today are incorporated. Time of use pricing, citing places that will increase adoption, et cetera. And I'd be happy to talk more about that. Thank you.
All right, hello again. I'm so excited to talk to y'all. I came right up here after lunch, and then a couple of panelists kindly informed me that I actually had to wait on my channel. So here I am for real. So I talked to you all about some work going on with smart charging. I kind of see it as, it's less about the D2G and all kind of on the umbrella of, in my head anyway, it's smart charging or managed charging. It's about what can be done kind of today, tomorrow, in the future to get those to A, reduce the cost, B, and then maximize the benefits. And what we see most importantly is make sure the customer can do whatever he or she needs to do. So I think one fact that it's important to think about is that after we get the charging stations installed and cars connected to them, cars, whether they're connected or not, most folks sit about 20 or 21 hours a day. Granted, if you're running UPS truck or something that's different, but personal vehicles, they sit at home, they sleep overnight, and they go to work, and they sit at work. And there's the data that show that, and again, the hypercommuters might be the exception, but most people, since they only they drive a certain distance, they only really need that 20, 21 hours. We saw a chart earlier this morning, they only need 2, 3, 4 hours to get a charge. What that means is you do have a load, and yes, it needs to be fulfilled, but you can actually move it around a lot during the course of the day. That's kind of that kind of set of levers is what underlines a lot of this smart charging. So the first, that's fine.
Michigan law, right?
It's all good.
Was that the one that was on?
No, it's.
That's me.
Okay. Let me have that again. Sorry about that.
I was once at there was once a EV show where the power went out. One of the keynote speakers actually gave a quite compelling, he just gave a presentation in the dark. I heard it's like one of the best presentations ever. So I'm hoping with my presentation, I won't put you to sleep or I won't fall asleep after having that great food for lunch.
Well, with V2G, you could power the audience back up.
So I'm going to talk about two things. I'll talk, there are three things. I'm going to quickly talk about the grid. Secondly, I'll talk about a pilot that EPRI did, I should say that Pepco, the utility out in Baltimore, DC did, that we were involved with. And then third, I'll talk about the Open Vehicle Grid Integration Platform, which I told the project manager it should be renamed the Free Pizza and Beer Project because it's easy to remember. All right, so here we go. So this is the grid, and this is complex and moving, and there are lots of parts. And at the end of the day, everyone in this room, and tons of people out there, make it such that people, when they flip on a switch, the power comes on and it stays on. And it's changing. So now we have, potentially high power charging closets, 2 to 4 megawatts worth of load. How do you manage that? We have buses, we have homes, we have workplace. Customers need to get where they're going. It's all electric transportation. Again, not every use case, but whether big or small, plays a huge role in kind of the grid of the future. The grid of the future is actually here today. So I'm going to talk a bit about why you might care. So we've seen, this is just the duck curve, 2 years ago in California, and in a couple years, and basically you can see it's the net load, right? And what is happening is more and more solar is coming on, which is actually this time, and then more and more load is coming. So the idea is that you can use electric vehicles to help maybe balance out that load. This is it kind of looks like something my 3-year-old would draw, but it's actually a hotspot map of distribution transformer line for Pepco we'll get to in a second. That might be another reason why it cares. How do you minimize, talking about kind of short-term benefits, infrastructure, distribution infrastructure, that's a very financial, very real cost that utilities have, every day, utility big or small. So how can you delay or minimize that investment through managed charging? That's one of the big questions. So first, let's talk about Pepco. So Pepco did this smart charging. It's basically a year and a half. Don't worry about any of this stuff. Basically, included these cards. It started in March of 2014. It went through September last year. And in case you haven't been in DC yesterday, here's Washington DC Cecil Square, and then pilot was up north and also a little bit down south. They had 101 customers, and the customers had a few options. They could either use their existing level 2 charger, they could buy a smart level 2 charger. They got a subsidy from Pepco. And that smart level 2 charger is important for a couple reasons. First of all, let Pepco do some demand response with them. And it was not the only smart, there are tons of network charging stations up and down that will do that. But it also had a, built into it, it had a metering chip. And then right on the other side of the charging station was the regular glass dials utility meter. So you could compare the usage out of the utility meter versus the chip. So they did this for a year. We ran it with them. So here are some quick results. Is that you can see, the Volt, the plug-in hybrid, actually not surprising, charges more times per day, whereas the Tesla and the Leaf were much closer. Interestingly, the Tesla used a lot of electricity every day, about 11.5 kilowatt hours, whereas the Leaf and the Volt were closer. And this report is all free online if you care to read it. Importantly, so things that, most customers don't really think in terms of kilowatt hours, think in dollars and cents. So customers cost are split into what they used off peak and what they used on peak, and here's their total, which is on average $21 a month extra. So if they stuck to the standard rate, their total would have been about $29. So the point is that the time of use rate, the education through the program, the pilot, save the customers about $8 a month. Again, they're not going to go out and buy a diamond ring with that, but it does. The combination of technology and education does work. So here's some more numbers for the nearly everyone in the room. So this looks at two different start times for the time of use rates, like when does off-peak time start, relative to kind of a forecasted BEV adoption. What you see is that as the not surprising, but if there's no time of use rate, then you have to spend more money sooner. Again, it's kind of the captain obvious conclusion. So now let's switch gears a little bit. I love this chart because it's so terrible. So it is an eye chart. This is we're going to talk a bit about the EPRI's open vehicle grid integration platform that we're doing with the car companies and the utility companies. The idea is that this is a cloud in the sky that basically lets any car, regardless of how they come, some have telematics, some don't. It lets any charging station, it lets aggregators, it basically lets anyone kind of connect to this cloud in the sky, and then that cloud communicates to a certain utility via open standards of ADR. Why that's important is it gives the utility kind of a holistic, it gives the utility a concrete view of what is going on in its service territory. What are the different cars? Where are they? How many kilowatt hours do they need? What are their customers' preferences? That's kind of what it comes down to, is kind of from a geographic perspective, what is out there, how is this a resource when it comes to utility perspective. What we're also doing in parallel is, we're going really deep on the transportation side of that. We have a lot of departments, not just a bunch of vehicles. So the guy on our team who's running this is also working with the different, whether it's a thermostat or a pool pump, and there are different technologies at home that also might benefit from this kind of platform. So the idea is we're going really deep on the cars, we're also going broad when it comes to customer-connected devices. And what we're trying to do is turn this complexity into this or this. So I figure that, if we all dream of vacation, then always, maybe those two pictures cover like 80% of what we wish for. And the idea is that, again, it's like, what I've seen a lot is, we're all involved in this kind of stuff, and the tech companies are involved, the car companies are involved with it. The early adopters are involved. At the end of the day, like to do a mass market, it all has to scale. It has to be easy. It has to be simple. I think, that is something that Tesla's done really well with their kind of combined car and charging, is that, and then their high-powered, supercharging network, is that, the reality is most of us work Monday through Friday or more, and then deal with family, get groceries and all that kind of stuff. So we kind of go back and forth, but what we dream about, what is emotionally inspiring, is how much time we spend that free time, with the family or with friends, what have you. Tesla's, their car with the big battery, the car's great, and then, their high-powered DC fast charging network kind of enables that dream. And, the other car companies are hot on their heels. We're seeing, as we talked about this morning, we're seeing a lot in the next 3 or 4 years. So I think the point is that this is really important for all of us to remember as we are working on this today, tomorrow, next year, is just to keep it simple as much as we can. So I think that's all I have for now. Thank you very much.
So before I turn this over to the people for questions, I was just curious, as I understand between you and Mr. Ellis, that this B2G is still kind of in the future. Do you have any ideas about when in the future we're looking to see that implemented?
Yeah, if I knew that, I'd go play the lottery. Place to invest. Stop working. So no, I agree with what was said earlier. I really see this, not only does this every car company utility project, it builds on kind of one-way power flow. It could be built toward two-way power flow if and when that ever comes out. I agree with James. There's a lot of, technically it can happen, the DOD's doing it at 3 or 4 different sites, and a couple of the startups have done it, but there's some hardware that's required on the car. There's interconnection issues. There's just a kind of a set of issues, and some of the kind of research questions we're proposing is, with one-way power flow with controlled charging, assuming you have all the customer preferences, what are the costs and benefits of that versus what are the costs and benefits potentially of this future two-way power flow? But I don't really see it. I mean, we've tested, last year we wrote a report on it. We had a Japanese spec. It was basically EPDC said, use your car to power your rice cooker. And I know Nissan's powered a couple rock shows using Nissan things. So, that kind of stuff is there, but if you think about it beyond that example, it's, if you were to use it as backup power, you can see that the advantages there, because, two-stroke little generators aren't that clean. But then you think about all the wiring you'd have to do to make that happen, or to make it last long. It's not an insignificant thing. But I think probably the thing that I used to hear a lot of PG&E and hear less and less now is there used to be this claim that oh, we're going to do V2G tomorrow, and that's going to put hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars per year in your pocket. The last report I read a few nights ago basically said about $200 a year. The question in my head I have with this two-way, so if and when that gets developed, cars, even when they can do it, even when there is a market, the way I see it is that their primary job is something else, not providing power. I figured even if they could. When it gets to that point, they'll be competing, in my head anyway, I might be wrong, they'll be competing with new batteries and used batteries, neither of which move around, neither of which have other jobs other than kind of storing and using electricity. So, then the loss of supply and demand kick in. So then maybe it's a fixed kind of demand for such services, and I guess an increasing supply, and then that would drive the market clearing price even lower. But again, that's kind of like the main question in my head long term, or one of the main questions is, what's the impact in the future?
No, I think that covers it.
Yep.
Are there any questions?
So I've heard at some national conferences about how University of Delaware ran a pilot program with PJM to deploy vehicle-to-grid storage. Is any of that going on with MISO or SPP? They bid into the ancillary services market?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, the action, they were really, Delaware and PJM were probably nationally the two biggest proponents of it. And a lot of the papers, a lot of the cost data came out of the early papers. I haven't seen anything, beyond that here.
No, I haven't.
The California ISO is looking at it. They're really eager about it because again, like a lot of places, California is trying to figure out every little lever they can pull to help make this happen sooner. But I think right now, they have a roadmap. They have in Southern California, they have a couple of these Department of Energy, there's some Department of Defense demonstrations, but I won't say they've come full stop, but they've definitely backed off on this might not happen tomorrow. Going again back to the fact everyone's going to get $1,000 a year in their wallet. I think it's a bit of reality. And it's exciting.
Oh, but the former life I had read the law in Delaware to make that happen. They had actually have enabling legislation which allows for that ETG demo. So they had to get a law that passed that said that University of Delaware could then have some sort of storage, VTG type net metering, which doesn't exist in other states.
Thank you.
A minute ago, Joe, you said there was depressive effects on rates were a potential. How much of a potential is that? Should we anticipate a decrease in rates if this goes into rate base?
Okay, so, and I think Dan will probably want to add on this as well. A depressive effect on rates is, as with many things I've said today, contingent on EVs at scale. And it is, the effect on rates is going to derive from added net revenue from more people buying electricity from the utility. And when you do that, you're spreading your fixed costs across more kilowatt hours. Now, what you have to do is if you're going to rate base EV charging equipment, that might incentivize greater adoption, might enable greater adoption of electric vehicles, might bring them and assist with scale that could enable such a load on the grid as to create a depressive effect on rates. But of course, whatever net revenue you're going to receive from those added electric vehicles has to be then netted against what you spent on the infrastructure in the first place. So whether an EV infrastructure whether cost recovery for an EV infrastructure program could be net zero, I don't think we've seen studies that indicate that. But we have seen studies indicate that a depressive effect on rates is possible within utility service territories and states and nationwide, given certain levels of EV adoption, and that the net benefit there could then be spent on infrastructure projects or partial infrastructure installation.
I would agree, and again, it goes back to that it's not just the light duty market. I mean, light duty is where we're largely starting. You know, a rough estimate back in the outlook was about 2,800 kilowatt hours per light duty vehicle per year. You want to be certainly call it 2,500. You want to be more optimistic, call it a bit more. But you know, then you start getting into forklifts and buses and seaports and riverports, and there's a whole bunch of kind of electric transportation there that can have increases in the rate base, increases the asset utilization. It's about what percentage of the overall transportation portfolio is you can move around. You know, some of the stuff like a bus. If a bus is charging mid-route because that's how it's designed, and then you got to provide the power. That's a very different case than at night if you have a parked electric vehicle, it's parked for 8, 10, 12 hours, but only need 3 hours to charge. And then all the cool technology in the background can move around those 3 hours to minimize or delay the distribution investment required.
Rob Hackett, KCP&L. A question about kind of the open VGI that you were talking about. I assume that contemplates participation of charging stations owned by both utilities and non-utility providers?
Yeah, it's basically a sponge. It lets anybody plug into it. Because that's part of the problem right now. Everything's so balkanized. And it's like a lot of technologies, everybody has their own, and rightfully so, their own network and their own technology. But from a utility perspective, you need to know what's going on in my area.
And under that construct, do you see similar grid benefits from utility-owned EV charging stations versus non-utility charging stations? And is that different than in a construct that is not open VGI?
So we haven't done the modeling yet to that level of detail, but holistically, the benefits are just pretty much the same. I mean, it's different as far as like what the utility gets added to the rate base, but as far as the benefit, again, it helps delay the extra cost that might be occasionally used and spread them out as much as possible.
But absent that kind of a construct, do you see the integration of these vehicle charging stations with the grid in a similar way, I guess, similar benefits or different benefits levels for utility-owned versus non-utility owned? Does that make sense?
Yeah, if I'm understanding. I think it makes sense. So I think the benefits are probably similar. It's more about two questions in my head are how do those two different examples, do they scale as quickly and are the costs the same?
Okay.
That would be more probably the two parts I could focus on first.
The question, I guess, from my mind is how much control does it would seem that the utility has more control over its own units versus the units that it does not own and control. And that would seem, in my mind, to allow for a greater level of benefits to be provided by utility-owned charging stations than non-utility, unless I'm way out of left field.
Yeah, I can see that argument. I mean, anything under anyone's direct control, you obviously have the potential for more benefits.
Thank you.
Joe, on your presentation, you talked 3 different rate designs: real-time pricing, time of use, and variable peak pricing. Do you know if there's a preference and the benefits of one over the other?
So, rate design, as Mr. Owens pointed out, is a complex undertaking. And for EVs, you're looking at a different set of value adds and subtracts. And trying to fashion a rate design that brings benefits to EV drivers and also covers cost cause and is equitable and is usable and is simple, implicates a number of questions. And so, a real-time dynamic rate that works on existing or day-ahead grid conditions, if it's simple enough and usable enough, and there's an interface for EV drivers to actually make use of it rather than be paralyzed by the amount of information they're being given, that could be an ideal model. However, a time of use rate, as I mentioned, is simpler. It's more of a blunt instrument. It approximates the cost of delivering power on the grid. And so, that might be a simpler mechanism, especially if you are looking at most of charging being installed at homes, where what you're really trying to do is incentivize off-peak at night charging that doesn't require, it's not looking at as dynamic of grid conditions as if you're trying to integrate renewables that are fluctuating in a period of a number of hours during the day. And so it's simply a matter of looking at your variable generation and a variety of different system elements and fashion into rate design. I'm not going to state a preference either way.
I mean, the researcher's answer is always more research, right? So that said, there already has been, rate design is extremely complicated. You're trying to incent behavior, minimize costs, social equity issues. I can only understand that I don't understand it. Back in the EV project days, they did a study in San Diego where they had 3 ratios of on-peak to off-peak pricing. I think it was 2-to-1, 4-to-1, and 6-to-1. That's right. And what they found is that the difference in customer behavior, this is just a fact from the report. The difference between 4-to-1 and 6-to-1 basically was minimal. So I guess the point is everyone has a cutoff, and there's kind of the 80-20 rule when you, at least from the driver perspective, when is it just worth it, when is it not? But the rates are so different. I mean, if some parts of the country, New York, California, might have higher rates, but some parts of Texas, where I used to live, it was kind of cheap all the time. I mean, that was a while ago, so it might have changed. But the point is that I think every utility has to look at this pretty hard.
Further questions? Okay, I can ask one more. My other question I have is when you were discussing consumer preferences, is there generally are these projects being done that the consumer is more sovereign in when things get charged or when not get charged, or is the utility given a lot of leeway?
Well, I think that's one thing that there's violent agreement on in the industry. I mean, the regulators, the charging companies, the car companies, all agree the customer is paramount. So I don't think anyone's going to intentionally set up some program that penalizes the customer or even makes them work hard. But I think that's the challenge that we all share. So I think they're all extremely customer focused.
If we have no more questions, this has been very interesting. Thank you. And if you can join me in thanking our panel.
At this time, we'll take a 15-minute break, so come back about 3:15. At this time, we have a presentation from Chuck Casely of Kansas City Power and Light on their project. Chuck is the Vice President of Marketing and Public Affairs for Great Plains Energy and KCP&L. In that role, he's responsible for the company's small-scale generation projects, energy products and services platform, energy efficiency and demand response portfolio, community and customer strategy and communications, marketing, economic development, governmental affairs, and public relations.
So I get the dubious distinction of being last, which is always nice after a full day of engagement. So a couple things just before we start here, right? First of all, one of the reasons and one of the motivational factors behind the Clean Charge Network was a day just like today. We very much hoped that by doing this, it would ring a bell, it would get some attention, and it would get folks talking about electric vehicles and talking about the benefits, talking about the costs, proactively thinking about policy and regulations. One of the things that I think tends to happen, and maybe it happens more on the utility side, but I would also say that there's an established group of folks that include staff and regulators, legislators, Office of Public Counsel. We have these things called statutes, and we have these things called rules, and they're hard to change, and they're precedential based. And so often what happens is those things don't keep up with what customers want, with environmental concerns, and with life itself. And so one of the things, just being very honest, we wanted to do is we wanted to start this conversation. And more importantly, so many of the conversations that happen in this area, in emergent issues, happen with modeling and happen with hypotheticals and happen about things that might or could happen. We thought, how much more interesting would it be if we put something out there, reasonably calculated, small in nature, and I'll get back to that in a minute, that actually put facts on the table so we could see what was happening and argue over numbers that are rather than numbers that might be under certain situations. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, this is a pilot project. This is a pilot project. The cost is $20 million. Now, I think when we asked to put a very small portion of this into our last rate case, the impact that we calculated to customers, the average residential customer was going to be about 2 cents a month from this. Now, that was that case. It would be a little disingenuous, though, to say that $20 million over 850,000 customers, that's going to be the average impact. So let's back up a little bit and say, okay, you know, if you just take the residential customers, you're around $2 or so, give or take, depending on how you look at it. But we recently had tax credits passed. That backs out about 50%. So now what we're talking about, what we're arguing over for this project, long term, 100% agree that there are long-lasting policy implications, and we need to get that right. But for this project, for the average residential customer, it's about $1 or so a year. And I just want to throw that out there because this truly is a pilot project. Finally, we don't think, we don't want, nor are we asking for the EV market, electric vehicles, charging, or anything to do with it to be regulated by the Public Service Commission. We don't think that's right. But we don't think what we're asking for, which is to rate-based infrastructure as part of a pilot project, which we believe will unlock a significant amount of benefits, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. We don't believe that those two things are mutually exclusive. Nothing would make us happier. Nothing would make us happier than for ChargePoint and their competitors to have a robust, competitive market where, driven by demand, because people are driving electric vehicles, people are driving carbon-free or zero-emission electric vehicles, and that they go out and they have a level playing field, they continue to innovate, and they put them up for third parties. What we would like to see is a policy conversation jump-started. We would like to see benefits come to the Kansas City metropolitan area, to our customers in Missouri and Kansas, quicker than they were going to otherwise. And we would like to see these benefits be quantified, be understood, and inform policy. So, with that, Time Magazine. Nobody, I would hazard a guess that nobody in the industry would have thought Time Magazine 2 years ago would have said that Kansas City might be the best place in the United States to own an electric vehicle. But I would submit to you, as you sit here today, and if you've gone to some of the other cities where it's only third-party networks at this point, that once they got a critical mass, They overcame range anxiety. Electric vehicles really took off. And now what do you have? You don't have the infrastructure to serve it. And so they're dealing with policy ramifications downstream from that. You're right. You know what? If a commissioner asks, if Office of Public Counsel asks, if staff inquires, I will readily admit, today we have 1,212 vehicles that are in our metro area, and we have 600 charging stations deployed out of 1,000 that we're going to do. That means 2 cars for every charging station publicly available. That's a great ratio. But that's exactly what we wanted. We wanted people to see that they could charge in their daily lives. We wanted people to see that range anxiety didn't have to be something that was a barrier. We wanted people to try out electric vehicles and see the value proposition that they offer. When we started this thing, I think the most surprising aspect was the fact that Republicans, Democrats, automakers, charging station companies, battery makers, consumers, I mean, you name it, we had folks that supported it. Jay Nixon, Democrat. Brownback, Republican. Both of them said nice things about this. The folks who want to attract economic development and businesses to our area said this is great for job recruitment, this is for talent recruitment, this is great for building the economy and reinvesting here, this is infrastructure we like. And of course, the organizing entity, the Mid-America Regional Council, which does so much of the compliance with the federal programs regionally that we have to, what do they like about this? Well, they like about this is maybe one way that the Kansas City area can meet future ozone attainment. And very, very specifically something that they called out. So the point is, whether it was businesses, whether it was people in the industry, the most surprising thing to us is when we talk to folks, not all, but 95% were very, very, very supportive. So what's happened since January of 2015? Well, we weren't on the map. Literally did not show up in data a year ago, a year and 6 months now, but you know, year over year, January to January, we didn't show up on the map. This year, Kansas City, according to Polk, is number 4 nationwide in terms of electric vehicle growth. And that's just new cars. That's not a developing used car market, which is only going to get better and better, but that's just used cars. So, the first question you might ask is what? Not everybody in the room probably knows what it is we're doing or how it is distinguishable from some of the other things that are out there. So let me give just a quick update on that. What we have proposed and what we're in the middle of implementing is putting out about 1,100 level 2 charging stations. I know everybody got the lingo earlier today, so I won't explain what that is. And we're putting out somewhere in the vicinity of 15 to 30 DC fast charge stations, 15 of which are already deployed. 600 of the level 2 are already deployed. We are doing it as if it is part of the electrical grid. Until we did this program, all of the electric vehicle charging stations in our service territory put out by third parties were put out behind the meter. They were put out as part of the customer's electrical system. These are designed and implemented just like they are an extension of our grid. In fact, that's how we treat them, that's how we're accounting for them, that's how we operate them. They've gone through our standards, we've talked through the metering, and all of this, with the exception of very few garages in downtown Kansas City where the cost to do it on our side of the grid would be too prohibitive, or some military and other federal government installations, which are campuses that have their own special requirements. With those exceptions, it's all on our side of the grid. They are installed in a similar way that we approach infrastructure. We don't install for load today, for demand today. We install for demand we anticipate. We want to get economies of scale, so these are done in 3 to 5 station clusters and have the ability to expand if at some point we or somebody else wants to. And of course, we've asked host locations to allow us to be there rent-free, to be there free. They have to allow us to be there, and we've asked them to pay for the charging that occurs there for the first 2 years of this program. So for the first 2 years of the Clean Charge Network, if you own an electric vehicle, you are registered on the Clean Charge /ChargePoint network, you can use your card, you can scan it, you can fuel up wherever you would like at any part of this for free. The great secret, though, is I would say somewhere around 75% of our host locations have already indicated that, particularly the retailers, that they don't ever intend to charge, that this is just a good customer benefit that they want to give. So that's just another thing that will be part of the infrastructure and part of what we're doing in Kansas City. Final thing is, we are absolutely interested in B2G, we're absolutely interested in time of use rates, and once this is fully deployed, having a network that with our partners in ChargePoint, we can look at data and we can look at deploying different programs. We will have truly the first and only place in the United States where an entire metro can actually run these programs, have a central data collection facility, and be able to, and we're willing to make all of that public so that it informs policy-making decisions along the way. So that's the Clean Charge Network. So why? Why are we doing it? Well, here's a couple of, there's about 6 areas of value that we see that go for customers and communities. But I want to talk just a little bit about this formula up here, because I realize I'm not an accountant. Nobody expected to see William Catcher today, did you? I realize I'm not an accountant. I'm a recovered lawyer. I'm not an engineer. Darren Ives and Rob Hack won't let me near any rate design. In fact, they try and make sure that I have as little exposure down here as possible. But this, as I understand it, is a rough approximation at a high level of the way we come up with rates in the state of Missouri. And what we have today is we've got investments in costs, right? And that's the numerator, and that's going up. I'm sure there are some folks in the audience who, if I ask, I'm not going to, but if I ask, could tell us how much KCP&L's rates have gone up over the last 10 years. That's environmental retrofits, renewable energy, O&M increases. There's a whole bunch of things driving that, but the bottom line is the numerator isn't standing still, it's going up. Now, if you have inclining usage, demand is growing like we've had for the last 30 years until the last about 5 or 6, then, inflation and kilowatt hour usage goes up, costs go up a little bit, and rates stay about the same. That's not what we have today, though. What do we have? We have distributed generation. There's some solar folks in the crowd tonight. They are driving usage down. Not a ton, but that's driving usage down. Energy efficiency, and I'm not just talking about utility programs for energy efficiency. I'm talking about the federal government has standards and products are being made more and more efficient. That's a good thing, but that stresses this formula, right? This 100-year-old formula, that stresses it. And what does electric vehicles do? Electric vehicles do 2 critical things. One, they put kilowatt hours back on the grid. Folks from the Sierra Club, every others have talked about that today. No. As we sit here today, this doesn't pencil just on that. But we're not talking about just today. We're not talking about 5 years from now. We're talking about being catalytic to an industry and in surface transportation that is the last part of the world economy that isn't electrified. The last part. Everything else runs on electricity. And somewhere between 35 to 40% of the energy consumed and the carbon and the EPA critical pollutants put out happen here. So just imagine if we got just a fraction of that. So it's scalable. It is something that adds kilowatt hours back to the grid. But the best thing about electric vehicles, you've heard it said earlier today, I've heard 70, the highest I saw was 85%, but a lot of that charging happens at home when people are what? They're sleeping. When do people drive their cars? They drive their cars to work. We've got tons of capacity on the system. They drive their cars and they charge their cars when they get to work. When there's tons of capacity, 8 to 10, 11, 12, they charge their cars overnight. And if you take those 2 times together, that's 80 to 90% of the charging that occurs. What's Priceline? What's Expedia? All those entities are taking technology and booking up excess capacity in markets that would be inefficient otherwise, right? So that's what electric vehicles are for the grid. And believe me when I tell you, as the last manufacturer in the world that sizes production to peak, that happens in a 2-hour time period, there is tons of capacity on this system. So before you get to time of use rates, before you get to all these other programs that could be enabled, just naturally, natural behavior says 80 to 90% of this is when we have a lot of capacity in generation and a lot of capacity on the grid. And by the way, the overnight charging is significantly higher in wind, which is when our wind portfolio is at its max. So that is why we think of this as smart electrification. And as you've heard, at scale, this can be a zero cost or maybe even have a depressing effect on rates. Just covered smart electrification. I want to run through a couple of these other things here real quick because it's not just about that. There's a bunch of other stuff here. So improved environment, everybody gets the carbon dioxide aspect of this. What a lot of people don't think about though is EPA critical pollutants and other controlled things by the EPA, other attainment goals that aren't even touched in most conversations. So your car, if you drive an internal combustion engine, is a little power plant, okay? It is a little power plant. We would not be allowed to operate that power plant from an efficiency or an emissions standpoint if it was in our fleet. Because there's too many EPA critical pollutants, it does too much to NOx, SOx, particulate matter, mercury. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that comes out of that tailpipe, right? Our plants at this point, even the coal ones that folks don't like, right? Even those are a lot cleaner than what comes out of the back of your tailpipe. So that's the first thing. The second thing, though, is on things like ozone attainment, we retrofit our plants. So most of the ozone depletion that occurs in the Kansas City metro region now happens because of surface transportation and other industrial processes. Why is Mark interested in this? Because this actually at scale can help us meet those attainment goals. So it's something they want to see if this is feasible. By the way, versus other types of things, this heavily leverages private funding to invest in this as well. We just put out a streetcar in Kansas City. Costs $150 million. Its ridership is going to average somewhere between 15 to 20,000 people, they think, when it all gets out there. Bottom line is we don't have a built-out mass transit system. Building out mass transit is extremely difficult. So if you want, in the Midwest in particular, so if you want to take an urban area that isn't as dense, you want to attack this problem, this surface transportation issue, then electrification and leveraging private funds to do that is a huge part of the solution. Improved environment. Economic development. Already talked about talent attraction, but this is all locally produced energy and it's cheaper, okay? Even with today's decade-low gasoline prices, you are still better off charging a car. It is still a more compelling economic proposition than filling up your car with gasoline. In fact, and so then instead of moving most of the dollars from that out of our service territory, you keep more in your pocket, and most of it stays here, benefiting the citizens right here in our service territory. We've talked a lot about customer programs, demand response, V2G, time of use rates. All of those are easier, and the effects are more easily studied, and the data is more easily accumulated if you have a networked system and you can look at it real time, you can look at it month over month. Utility costs and infrastructure advantages. We bought at scale, right? So the price that we pay just out of the box for the equipment is significantly less than one-off, right? But it's not just that. Our engineering teams have developed standard designs. And so now we stamp these things out. We know how to do it. We are driving costs out of the system. Now, what does that mean? That means that over the broad spectrum of this project, we are enabling other people to get into this at a price that is more affordable, right? The more that charging infrastructure companies have deployed, their fixed costs go down, just like our fixed costs go down, which means the more scale they have, the cheaper it is, and the easier it is, actually, to have a more robust competitive market. Finally, I mentioned when we started this, we want proactive policy. We think having a conversation before we get to something like is going on in the Bay Area, before you have all sorts of of size invested in one particular business model or one particular way. We'd like to jumpstart this, both from an adoption standpoint and from a policy standpoint. And at the end of the day, honestly, our fondest wish out of this is that vehicle adoption would be significantly higher here, that we would see the environmental benefits, and then we don't want to be in the charging station business. We'll help make the grid accessible. We want to still see the innovation, and we want to see a vibrant market that is in some places, but is 10 years away from being here unless we drive vehicle adoption and unless we get started right now. So just some other facts and figures here. We're now number one in driver growth year over year since we started this. And we are number one in terms of charging stations, although that's kind of a humble brag, right? Because of course we are. We're putting out a pilot program where we're putting them up and the other metros are not, so that really shouldn't be surprising. But I would add that a significant number is not from KCP&L's program. So again, talking about a vibrant market, we only have 600 deployed in this year time period. So there's still a significant amount of people that are out there doing this very thing. We've seen a 523% increase in month-over-month drivers charging on the system in a year. We've seen a 550% increase in EV monthly charging sessions in a little over a year. And we've seen a 405% increase in energy charge on the Clean Charge network. But here's the thing. Remember, we're talking about going back to 70 to 85%, depending on which study you cite, of the charging occurs not on our system, but at home. So just think about that, because that kind of puts this into context. So that's the Clean Charge network. That's what we're doing. I think that as we approach this in a formal regulatory session rather than a working docket, our ask is going to ultimately be that we rate base this. We're very open to rate design. We're very open to all the stakeholder input that's been had here today. But we think for unlocking and being catalytic for this at a average of a $1 per residential customer a year cost, there is a tremendous upside. And that ultimately, I know earlier today, I think it was a couple of council who talked about Massachusetts. It seemed like maybe you liked the Massachusetts, you thought there were some good things in there. I agree. It doesn't mandate rate-based treatment. Don't think rate-based treatment should be mandated. It doesn't regulate the industry. We don't want this to be regulated. We want a vibrant, competitive, innovative marketplace. In fact, that's what we're trying to cause that. We're trying to be a catalyst for that. We want and think that if utilities are going to continue to be involved in this, whether it is doing all the way to the end station, whether it's just doing the make-ready work and making the system accessible, which is, by the way, something we are absolutely fine with when this market takes off, we think that you should have to prove, ultimately, to continue something like this, the benefits for customers outweigh the cost. Can I do that sitting here today? No, you heard other folks say that everything that's out there right now is modeling and conjecture. We think that by the end of this program, we'll be able to show one way or another, and we wholeheartedly believe that that's the conclusion and what will happen with the project. So thank you for allowing us to talk a little bit about the project. I think it's at least one of the things that's gotten this conversation going. It is great to see everybody here talking about this issue and proactively discussing this before it's before it becomes something that is upon us and we waited too long, and just appreciate the time today.
Are there any questions for Chuck?
Martin Hyman, Division of Energy. Did I hear you right when you said that about half of the Clean Charge Network was covered by various incentives?
Yeah, so there's taxes, the recent state tax incentives, and our calculation at this moment is that the whole project is right around $20 million. Of course, that's not Missouri jurisdictional, that's Missouri and Kansas, and we've got to allocate all that, blah, blah, blah. But about half of the cost for Missouri customers, we believe will ultimately be rebated for the tax credit. So, yes. Great news, right?
Other questions?
Great, thanks.
Mr. Casey, Joe also from the Sierra Club. Yeah, great presentation, thank you. You noted that, time of use rates aren't necessary yet, given the percentage of charging that's going to happen at home, and normal human behavior suggests that charging will occur overnight, which will affect the benefits we would like to see for time of use anyhow. Tell me, if you can, how and whether that relates to the Clean Charge Network, which as I understand it, doesn't put charging stations in homes.
That's right. So there's a lot of good stuff there. I'm going to try and cover off on several things real quick. First of all, we're hoping at some point to put some charging stations in homes, level 2 charging stations in homes, pay for those, and so that we'll have that component of at least being able to take a subset, whether it's 30 or 50, and be able to see and quantify some of those things. One of the things we really like about ChargePoint is their platform, right? They've got a great customer interface platform. Their innovation, way better than a utility would do, and you know what? They're going to keep that up over time. Just like my iPhone, their system can be updated, and they don't stop innovating once it goes into the ground. They keep doing it, on a daily basis. So when we think of time of use rates, the first thing that we think of is, unlike so many other things, and even up to including energy efficiency, where you need price signals, where you need behavioral modification, where you need peer pressure, where you need a accumulation of these things to achieve a result. Most of this just happens naturally by the way we are. And by the way, we have seen, and data that we have for charging on our system is bearing this out. So we can talk about this being theoretical in a whole bunch of different places, and it seems very logical, but the data that we're getting for usage on our system seems to bear this out. Okay, past that though, when you have infrastructure that we can gather data from all these different places, and we can do two things. One, we can implement a program and really see past a much smaller data set how various aspects of that program work. But the other thing is, look, we believe that ChargePoint will be able to send seamless price signals. And so somebody said, I can't remember who it was, but somebody said time of use rates can get very complicated. And if you have to think about it and do the value proposition and this, that, and the other, that is counterintuitive to being able to, well, we think that having a system like this and a platform as robust as ChargePoint's will be able to interface with that customer so much easier, which will make time of use rates that much more effective. To be clear, we don't think that we have to have time of use rates, at least in the beginning, to make this an effective price line for the grid. What we do think, though, is having a network will make it easier to test different programs, easier to gather results, and ultimately the biggest barrier to time of use rates that we've seen in a bunch of different applications is customer interface. Utilities aren't good, and frankly neither are regulators, are good at designing customer-friendly programs. ChargePoint is. So we think they have a platform we could work with them and present this. Maybe it's even automatic, right? I mean, what if the charging station that's in your home or the charging station that is at work just sends you a text message and says, I'm going to charge your car for free. I'm going to schedule it during this time unless you say otherwise because we've got a duck curve. That's not our area, but maybe it's overnight. Maybe it's, so those are the kinds of things when we think about time of use rates and the benefits of having a utility system or utility backbone that kind of come to mind.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Next on our agenda, it says open discussion. This is an opportunity, if there's anything that we missed that you want to raise or that you think we should take a look into as we work on our report. If there are questions that you were burning to ask earlier, but we had to cut off the Q&A because of the timing of the panel. So this is your opportunity. Any last minute things that you want to say or ask? Or everybody's just tired? Mark?
I think I can probably ask loud enough. Just as
I'm just curious, given this is called an informational docket that's open right now, just as what is the purpose of the report that staff will write, and will it make recommendations, or will it just summarize your learning through the course of the data requests or the questions and the workshop, or what's the end goal of the report that staff will write? Thank you.
The order just directed us to basically conduct this workshop, this forum, and write a report providing information that we gathered. So at this point, I don't see us making any recommendations. It would just be a report on all the different information that we were able to glean, whether it be from today, from the various questions that people answered earlier. I know we have some people making filings to the docket even as we speak. I saw at lunch a couple of the speakers that weren't able to make it today had filed some things. So just pulling all that information together in kind of one concise place for the commission to take a look. If we happen to come across something that jumps out as, hey, it should definitely be this way or not, we might make a recommendation, but at this point, I don't see us making a recommendation.
Will that report be public record soon, though?
Yes, it's due July 1st, and there's an opportunity for responses September 1st. So you would have a couple months to review it and respond to it if you have anything you want to respond to.
Hi, I just want to make one clarification for those of you that haven't used a charge point station as to how we communicate pricing to drivers, because there was a couple speakers that referenced it, and there seemed to be some confusion about that. Although Chuck said some good points on it to clarify at the end. So right now, if you go to use a charge point station, your pricing is displayed both on the app, it's online, it's on the station itself. Most stations are free in both Kansas and Missouri right now. But if you do have pricing, flexible pricing, for example, we have some dealerships that have charging stations where if you're going to buy a car, you can use the charging station for free. You're an employee of the dealership, you can use it for free. But if you're just going there to use the charging station, then it's $1 an hour. There's about 5 stations that have that. And we're putting it into the docket, but if you've never used the station, we're happy to show you the app and how that pricing is communicated. And again, ChargePoint does not set the pricing at the stations. We sell the stations, so either Casey Pinnell is the owner or whomever owns that station sets the pricing.
Thank you. Anything else? Okay, well, as I mentioned, oh, go ahead. That's okay.
Just one note, it seems to me from the order initiating this docket that one primary charge for staff was to deal with sort of the threshold regulatory issue of how should the commission treat charging stations, whether non-utility or utility-owned. And I was surprised to hear today, I think, a lot more agreement among stakeholders than I would have gathered from some of the filings back in April. And so I would just submit to commission staff that might be one area where there is a greater deal of agreement among stakeholders, one area that might be a wiser recommendation to the commission.
I got a quick question, and Sal, could you
Could you give us a sense of, what the next steps are in this process?
That was next.
Great.
We will be putting all the slides in EFIS from today's presentations, and as I mentioned, the couple speakers that weren't able to make it are putting some information in. We have received some information. There was an order that came out, was it last week, where the commissioners asked for information from KCPL on the charging stations in their area and what kind of use there is and that type of thing. And we expanded that and asked for information statewide, so that information will be going in the docket. So if there's anything that you see that's either being put into the docket or that struck a nerve today, piqued your interest, and you want to respond to it, if you could put something in the docket by June 8th, that would be 2 weeks from today, then that would still give us a couple weeks to pull it all together and include it in our report or consider it for our report. So we will get the slides in EFIS as soon as possible. Any additional comments or responses by June 8th. Our report is due July 1st, and that will be filed in the docket, which is EW-2016-0123. And then responses are due September 1st. And then at that point, it's up to the commission. Anything else? I'd like to thank all the staff people that helped pull this together, and especially Byron Murray. He's been in touch with many of you, and he's done a lot of the legwork. Michael Stallman has done a lot of the legwork. So if you could join me in thanking staff, I'd appreciate it. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming in and providing such good conversation today. Thank you.